Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The Hunter in the Swamps of Alabama. The swamp stretched endlessly before Jack, a hunter who had seen his fair share of wilderness but had never ventured into these parts of Alabama. This wasn't just another hunting trip, it was a chance to prove himself. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the swamp, warning travelers of its dangers. But Jack dismissed their words as the ramblings of overly cautious townsfolk. He wasn't the kind of man to be swayed by rumors. Pulling his truck off the narrow dirt road, Jack parked at the edge of the wetlands. The late afternoon sun filtered through the Spanish moss, painting the water in hues of gold and orange. He stepped out, his boots landing on the soft, uneven ground with a squelch. The air was stifling, a heavy mix of humidity and decay. Each breath felt thick, as if the swamp itself was alive, forcing its presence into his lungs. Jack opened the tailgate of his truck and began unpacking his gear. His rifle gleamed in the fading light, a comforting presence against the unknown. Beside it lay a hunting knife, a flashlight, a compass, and enough provisions to last him several days. This was routine for him. He had spent years hunting in forests and plains. The swamp was just another landscape, or so he thought. The distant cry of a bird broke the stillness, its eerie call echoing across the water. Jack paused, scanning the horizon. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled roots twisting into the water like skeletal hands. The deeper he stared, the more the swamp seemed to shift, its shadows alive with movement. "Focus," he muttered to himself, shaking off the unease. Slinging his rifle over his shoulder, he adjusted his backpack and set off into the swamp. The ground beneath him was uneven, alternating between solid patches and hidden pools of water. Every step demanded attention, and every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. As Jack ventured farther, the familiar sights and sounds of civilization faded. There were no roads, no power lines, no signs of human interference, just the swamp and its overwhelming presence. The air grew cooler, tinged with the faint scent of rot and something else he couldn't quite place. He had been walking for less than an hour when he stumbled upon his first sign of life, a set of tracks in the mud. Jack crouched, examining them closely. They were large, clawed, and unlike anything he had seen before. At first, he thought they belonged to a bear, but the spacing between the prints was too wide, the shape too irregular. "Maybe a big cat," he whispered, though the explanation felt hollow. He glanced around, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The swamp, which had been eerily silent, now seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. Jack stood, shaking his head. "Just your imagination," he said aloud, as if to convince himself. But the uneasy feeling lingered, a nagging presence at the edge of his thoughts. He moved on, keeping his rifle close and his senses sharp. Night was approaching, and the swamp's shadows deepened. Jack found a dry patch of ground near a cluster of trees and began setting up camp. The swamp's noises shifted with the dusk, a symphony of croaks, rustles, and distant splashes filled the air. It was alive in a way that felt different from the forests he knew. As he lit his campfire, the flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. The light seemed to push back the swamp, creating a small, fragile bubble of safety. Jack sat on a log, staring into the darkness beyond the fire. The unease from earlier had grown, coiling in his chest like a snake. Something moved in the distance, a brief flicker of motion at the edge of his vision. Jack turned sharply, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. But when he stared into the blackness, there was nothing there. Just the endless maze of trees and water. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to relax. "Get a grip, Jack," he muttered, settling back by the fire. But even as he tried to push the thought away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The swamp watched, and it waited. The swamp was alive, but not in a way that brought comfort. It breathed with a slow, oppressive rhythm, the thick air clinging to Jack's skin like a damp shroud. The humidity was suffocating, making every breath feel heavy. A faint mist curled around the gnarled cypress trees, wrapping their roots in ghostly tendrils that stretched into the black, still waters. Above, the canopy of trees barely let through the fading sunlight, casting the swamp in an otherworldly twilight. What light did filter through seemed distorted, bending and twisting in the haze. The sky, once a pale blue, had been replaced by a dull, smoky gray that hung over the swamp like a veil. The silence was the most unsettling. There were no chirping crickets or singing birds, no rustling leaves or wind. Just an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional distant splash or the low drone of unseen insects. The sound carried oddly, as though the swamp itself swallowed most of it, letting only faint echoes reach Jack's ears. The water was dark and stagnant, its surface broken by patches of floating algae and scattered debris. Every step Jack took along the uneven, muddy ground felt precarious, the squelch of his boots accompanied by the subtle shift of the swamp beneath him. Occasionally, something moved in the distance, a ripple in the water, or rustle among the reeds. Jack tried to dismiss it as harmless creatures, but the shapes were indistinct, the movements too quick or too slow to feel normal. The isolation was overwhelming. The further Jack walked, the more he felt the world outside slipping away. The swamp seemed endless, a labyrinth of trees, water, and shadows that blurred into one another. There were no landmarks, no sense of direction, only the ever-present fog that thickened the deeper he ventured. Jack adjusted his pack and wiped his forehead, the sweat mingling with the dampness in the air. Despite his experience in the wild, the swamp felt different, unnatural. It wasn't just the landscape, it was the way it pressed down on him, as though it wanted him to turn back, to leave and never return. Somewhere in the distance, a faint, guttural sound broke the silence, too low and distorted to identify. Jack froze, his grip tightening on the rifle. The sound didn't repeat, leaving him to wonder if he'd imagined it. Shaking his head, he muttered to himself, just the swamp playing tricks. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Jack's boots sank into the soft, damp ground as he trudged deeper into the swamp. The light was fading quickly, the murky shadows growing longer and darker with each step. His senses remained sharp, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of movement, his ears tuned to the swamp's eerie symphony of distant splashes and droning insects. It wasn't long before something caught his attention, a set of tracks in the mud. Jack crouched, running his fingers lightly over the impressions. The prints were large, deeply pressed into the soil, and had an odd, claw-like shape. He frowned, tracing their outline with his gaze. They were unlike anything he'd seen before, too elongated and too far apart to belong to a bear or any other predator he knew. Big cat, maybe, he muttered under his breath. He wanted to believe it. Cougars were rare in these parts, but not impossible. The thought felt safe, grounded. Still, something about the tracks didn't sit right. He measured the stride length with his eyes. It was unnaturally wide, as if whatever left them moved with incredible speed or size. Jack stood and glanced around, his rifle shifting slightly in his grip. The swamp around him seemed unnervingly still, as though it, too, was watching the tracks. He followed their trail for a few paces, noting how they veered off into a patch of waterlogged reeds. The ground beyond was too wet to hold an impression, the tracks disappearing into the shadows. He shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Just a big animal, that's all," he said aloud, the sound of his own voice oddly comforting. Animals left tracks all the time, and this swamp was bound to hold surprises. Still, as he turned to continue on his way, a shiver ran up his spine. The swamp's silence seemed to deepen, the distant hum of insects muffled, the stillness pressing in around him. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the tracks weren't the only thing out of place. Every instinct he had, honed by years of hunting, told him something was wrong. But he dismissed it. He had a job to do, and fear wouldn't help him bag any game. "Focus, Jack," he muttered, gripping his rifle a little tighter as he pressed forward. Behind him, the swamp seemed to shift, the darkness pooling in shapes that defied explanation. He didn't look back. The swamp opened into a small clearing where a ramshackle hut stood precariously on stilts above the muddy ground. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney, blending into the low-hanging mist. Jack hadn't expected to see signs of human life this deep into the swamp. His curiosity outweighed his caution, and he approached the hut, his boots squelching in the mud. As Jack neared, a wiry old man emerged from the doorway, his face obscured by a tangle of unkempt beard and shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He leaned heavily on a crude walking stick, his piercing eyes scanning Jack with a mix of suspicion and something else, pity, perhaps. "Don't see many folk this far in," the man croaked, his voice as weathered as the planks of his home. "Just passing through," Jack replied, offering a polite nod. "Looking for game?" The hermit's gaze hardened. "You best turn back. There ain't nothing in these swamps worth hunting." Jack chuckled, adjusting the strap of his rifle. "Appreciate the concern, old-timer, but I've been hunting all my life. Swamp's just another patch of woods to me." The hermit's lips curled into a grim line. "This ain't just any swamp. There's a beast out here, a hunter, like yourself, but it ain't human. Not anymore." Jack raised an eyebrow, suppressing a grin. He heard plenty of tall tales from locals in his travels, each more outlandish than the last. "A beast, huh? What kind of beast?" The hermit stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper as if the swamp itself might overhear. "It moves like a shadow, fast, silent. Leaves tracks that don't make sense, like it ain't bound by the same rules as us. Folks who've seen it don't come back, least not alive." Jack couldn't help but laugh, the sound breaking the heavy silence of the swamp. "Sounds like a good story to tell around a campfire, old man. Appreciate the warning, but I can handle myself." The hermit didn't flinch at Jack's dismissal. Instead, he stared deep into Jack's eyes, his voice growing colder. "You don't listen, you'll be another story for the swamp." Jack tipped his cap in mock gratitude. "I'll keep that in mind." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the trees, the hermit's gaze burning into his back like a physical weight. As he disappeared into the swamp, the hermit muttered under his breath, "Fool. The swamp always takes what it's owed." Jack didn't hear him. Even if he had, he wouldn't have cared. The idea of a beast was absurd. He'd faced predators before, bears, wolves, mountain lions. Whatever was out here, he was certain his rifle could handle it. Yet, as he walked away, a strange unease crept into his mind. The swamp seemed darker now, the air heavier. The hermit's words lingered, unwelcome, at the edge of his thoughts. By the time Jack set up camp, the swamp was draped in a suffocating darkness. The meager light from his lantern barely pierced the fog, casting long, flickering shadows that danced like ghostly figures among the trees. He had cleared a small patch of ground near a cluster of cypress roots, the water too close for comfort but unavoidable in the swamp's endless sprawl. After a quick, cold meal, Jack lay on his bedroll, his rifle within arm's reach. The weight of the day had worn him down, and he stretched out with a sigh, trying to ignore the clammy chill that seeped through his clothes. The sounds of the swamp returned with the night, chirps, croaks, and the occasional splash. Comforting, in their way, like a song to lull him to sleep. But as the hours dragged on, those sounds began to shift. The chirping of insects grew sporadic, fading into an unnatural stillness. Jack stirred, his eyes snapping open as a low, guttural noise echoed through the trees. It wasn't far, and it wasn't familiar. Sitting upright, he strained his ears, his breath caught in his chest. There it was again, closer this time. A heavy rustling, like something large moving through the reeds. Jack gripped his rifle, his knuckles white against the cold metal. "Just a gator," he whispered to himself, though his voice trembled. "Nothing to worry about." The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie quiet. Then came a sound that sent ice through Jack's veins, a low, rhythmic tapping, like claws drumming against wood. It came from the direction of the water, deliberate and unrelenting. Jack rose slowly, his boots sinking into the soft ground as he moved toward the edge of his camp. His lantern swayed in his hand, casting jittery light over the water's surface. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it began. The swamp held its breath. Jack turned in a slow circle, his rifle raised, every nerve in his body screaming for an explanation. A shadow darted between the trees, too quick to follow. His heart pounded in his chest as he swung the lantern in its direction, but nothing was there, only the shifting fog. "Get a grip," he muttered, lowering the rifle slightly. But as he turned back toward his camp, something caught his eye, a set of tracks in the mud, leading from the water to the edge of his sleeping area. The same clawed tracks he'd seen earlier, only now they circled his bedroll before disappearing back into the darkness. Jack's breathing quickened. He backed toward the campfire, feeding it more wood until the flames roared higher. He sat with his back to the blaze, gripping his rifle tightly, scanning the darkness. The swamp was no longer a place of idle curiosity. It was watching him now, alive with unseen eyes, its depths hiding something that didn't belong. Something that wanted him to know it was there. Jack didn't sleep that night. He didn't dare. The first light of dawn crept into the swamp, weak and pale, barely cutting through the fog. Jack's eyes were bloodshot and heavy from a sleepless night. His rifle rested across his knees, his fingers stiff from clutching it for hours. The swamp was quiet again, the oppressive stillness broken only by the occasional drip of water from the cypress trees. As the fire crackled softly, Jack forced himself to stand, his joints protesting from the damp cold. He stretched, scanning the perimeter of his camp with wary eyes. It wasn't until he stepped toward the edge of the clearing that his breath caught in his throat. There, pressed into the soft mud, were fresh tracks, deep, clawed impressions that circled his camp in a wide arc. They were similar to the ones he'd seen the day before, but larger, more deliberate, as if the creature had been stalking him in the hours of darkness. Jack crouched to examine them, his stomach twisting. The size alone was unnerving, but it was the spacing that sent a chill down his spine. Whatever had made these tracks move with a stride far longer than any predator he knew. The claws dug deep, the weight behind them suggesting something massive. He followed the trail with his eyes, watching how it wove in and out of the underbrush. The tracks stopped abruptly a few yards away, disappearing into the water. There were no splashes, no signs of disturbed vegetation. It was as if the thing had simply vanished. Jack felt a gnawing sense of dread. He tried to rationalize it, forcing himself to think logically. "A big cat," he whispered, though the words rang hollow. "Or a bear, maybe." But he knew better. No bear or cougar moved like this, not with tracks that vanished without a trace. The swamp seemed to mock him with its silence, the usual sounds of morning absent. Jack felt a deep unease, as if the swamp itself was complicit in hiding whatever creature had been here. He glanced back at his campfire, now little more than smoldering embers. The thought of spending another night in this place was unbearable, but leaving without answers felt equally wrong. He wasn't the type to run from a challenge, no matter how strange. Still, the weight of the tracks pressed on him. Something had been watching him, circling him, and it had come close, far too close. He clenched his jaw and tightened his grip on his rifle. "Whatever you are," he muttered, his voice low and defiant, "I'll find you before you find me." But even as he said the words, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too late. The swamp wasn't just hiding a predator, it was alive with its presence, and it wasn't going to let him leave easily. As the sun clawed its way into the sky, Jack shouldered his pack and rifle, moving cautiously through the swamp. The air was heavy with moisture, clinging to his skin like a damp shroud. Each step he took felt muffled, the ground swallowing the crunch of twigs and the squelch of mud. The silence unnerved him. The usual symphony of swamp life, the croaks of frogs, the distant cries of birds, was absent. It was as if the swamp had drawn a collective breath and was holding it, waiting for something to happen. Jack's eyes darted between the twisted cypress trees and the mist that curled around their roots like tendrils. Shadows seemed to shift at the edges of his vision, moving just out of focus. He spun around more than once, rifle raised, only to find nothing there. The sense of being watched was unrelenting, a prickling sensation crawling up his spine. His instincts, honed from years of hunting, screamed that he wasn't alone. Yet, every time he turned to confront the feeling, the swamp offered no answers. He paused by a fallen tree, leaning against its moss-covered trunk to catch his breath. The air felt thicker here, almost suffocating. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out what little sound remained. "It's just the isolation," he muttered, his voice strained. "Your mind's playing tricks on you." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. This wasn't his first time hunting alone, and he never felt anything like this before. The swamp didn't just feel empty, it felt alive, as though it were a sentient thing, watching his every move. He tried to shake the thought, focusing on the task at hand. But as he moved deeper into the swamp, the oppressive silence seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on him like a physical weight. The shadows between the trees felt darker, more menacing. Jack tightened his grip on his rifle, his knuckles white against the stock. His breath came in shallow bursts as he scanned his surroundings, looking for any sign of movement. The swamp refused to give up its secrets, but the feeling of being watched never wavered. It was as though the swamp itself had eyes, hidden in the twisting roots and hanging moss, and they were fixed on him. Jack quickened his pace, his boots splashing through shallow pools of water, the sound loud and jarring in the unnatural quiet. "Keep it together," he told himself, his voice barely a whisper. But the words offered little comfort. No matter how far he walked, the feeling stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. The swamp had become more than a place. It was a presence, an unspoken threat. And Jack was in its sights. The path through the swamp grew more treacherous as Jack pressed on, the ground beneath him turning to patches of slippery moss and waterlogged mud. His boots squelched with every step, leaving faint ripples in the pools he passed. The silence, already oppressive, seemed to deepen, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Jack was focused on scanning his surroundings, his rifle ready, when he caught a foul stench in the air. It was thick and cloying, a mixture of rot and metallic tang that made his stomach turn. His pace slowed as he tried to pinpoint the source. The smell grew stronger, almost unbearable, until he found himself standing in a small clearing. At first, he didn't see it. The fog clung low to the ground, obscuring the details. But as Jack took another cautious step forward, his boots struck something solid. He looked down and froze. A carcass lay sprawled in the mud, its form twisted and unnatural. It was unrecognizable at first glance, the flesh torn and mangled beyond comprehension. A closer look revealed it to be a deer, or at least what was left of one. Its ribs jutted out like skeletal fingers, the fur matted with blood and swamp muck. Jack crouched down, his face grim as he inspected the remains. This wasn't the work of scavengers. The wounds were too clean, the flesh stripped in long, deliberate gashes. Whatever had killed the animal hadn't done so for food, it was as if it had been killed out of sheer violence. The ground around the carcass was a mess of disturbed mud and clawed impressions. The tracks were similar to the ones he'd seen earlier, deep and sharp, each print larger than his own boot. They circled the carcass in a chaotic pattern before leading off into the dense undergrowth. Jack felt a chill creep over him. He hunted predators before, seen the aftermath of their kills, but this was different. The sheer brutality of it was unsettling, unnatural. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see eyes staring back at him from the mist. His instincts told him to leave, to turn back and put as much distance as possible between himself and this place. But another part of him, the part that had brought him to the swamp in the first place, urged him to stay, to understand what he was dealing with. He straightened, his rifle at the ready, and took a deep breath to steady himself. The swamp felt even quieter now, as if it, too, was holding its breath. Jack's unease grew with every passing moment, the weight of the carcass and the tracks pressing heavily on his mind. "This isn't normal," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He took one last look at the mangled remains before turning to follow the tracks. He knew it was a risk, but he couldn't shake the feeling that running would only make him prey. Whatever was out here, it wasn't done. Jack moved cautiously, the mangled carcass still haunting his mind as he followed the clawed tracks deeper into the swamp. The air grew thicker, clinging to his skin with each step. The ground became more treacherous, the water pooling around his boots and mud sucking at his feet. His grip on the rifle tightened, his senses heightened as the oppressive silence pressed in from all sides. He hadn't gone far when he saw it, just a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks with the trees, or perhaps a bird taking flight in the distance. But the more he stared, the clearer it became. A shadow darted between the cypress trees, too fast to be anything natural. It was a blur of motion, like a figure sprinting, but its movement was wrong. It didn't run like a man or any animal Jack had ever seen. The limbs were too long, the speed too unnatural. In a split second, the figure vanished behind a thicket of twisted roots and mist. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He stood motionless, staring at the spot where the figure had been, trying to convince himself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, or perhaps his imagination working overtime. But the knot in his stomach told him otherwise. He slowly raised his rifle, scanning the trees and waterline. Nothing. The swamp, as always, was silent, holding its secrets tight. The figure was gone, but the sensation of being watched deepened, clawing at him like a physical force. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it again. This time, it was closer. A shape moving just beyond the veil of mist, its form shifting and distorting unnaturally. It wasn't human, nor was it any creature Jack recognized. It was as though the swamp itself had birthed this thing, and it moved with a predatory grace that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was fast, too fast to follow with his eyes. The moment Jack tried to focus, it slipped out of view again, swallowed whole by the fog and shadows. His breath caught in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a moment, time seemed to slow, and the world around him shrank into a suffocating tunnel. He wanted to run. Every instinct in his body screamed to flee, but his legs refused to obey. He felt rooted to the spot, a mixture of terror and curiosity paralyzing him. What was that? A low growl, barely audible over the rush of adrenaline in his ears, broke the silence. It was distant at first, then closer, closer still, until it reverberated through the ground beneath his feet. It was a sound unlike anything Jack had heard before, deep and primal, vibrating in his chest. The growl seemed to emanate from everywhere, as if the swamp itself were alive, thrumming with a life of its own. Jack's fingers tightened around the rifle's stock. Whatever that was, it wasn't just a predator. It was something else. Something that had no place in this world. And it was hunting him. He backed away slowly, eyes darting to every shadow, every rustle in the underbrush. The creature, whatever it was, had left a mark on his soul. Jack knew now that it wasn't going to stop. It was out there, somewhere, and it was coming for him. Jack didn't hesitate. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, instinct taking over as he broke into a sprint, his boots slapping against the soft, wet ground. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a drum of dread as he fought to put distance between himself and whatever had just been watching him. The swamp, once a place of isolation and mystery, now felt like a maze of danger closing in around him. He didn't look back, he couldn't. He could feel it, though. The weight of something behind him, lurking just out of view, its presence suffocating the air. The growl from moments before echoed in his ears, low and vibrating, like a warning. The branches overhead swayed in the breeze, their gnarled limbs reaching out like skeletal hands, but it wasn't the wind that made them rustle. Jack felt it then, the snap of a twig. A faint sound, too faint to be noticed by anything other than someone already on edge. His body reacted before he could think, and he whipped his head over his shoulder. Nothing. But the chill crawling up his spine told him everything he needed to know. He wasn't alone. The creature was moving in tandem with him, its movements quick and calculated. Jack could feel it, close, too close. His lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, his legs aching with every stride. He dodged through the swamp's treacherous roots, his feet sliding dangerously in the muck, but he refused to slow down. He had no choice. The swamp was its home, not his. Another snap of branches behind him. Louder this time. Closer. Jack's breath hitched. He dared another glance back, just a fleeting second, but it was enough. There, through the fog, was the blur again, the shadow that moved too fast to be anything natural. The shape was growing clearer now, less fleeting, its outline growing more distinct with every step Jack took. It was fast. Far too fast. A flash of long, sinewy limbs. A silhouette that seemed to ripple with unnatural speed. The creature was toying with him, staying just out of reach, but Jack could feel its eyes on him, its hunger almost palpable. It knew he was running, and it was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He stumbled over a root, his ankle twisting painfully, and for a split second, he thought he might fall. But adrenaline surged through him, and he righted himself in one frantic motion, pushing forward with renewed desperation. A low growl vibrated the air again, closer now, and this time it wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Jack could hear the sound of its movements now, rhythmic, purposeful, closer than ever before. Each step felt like it was right behind him, hot breath on the back of his neck, but when he looked back, nothing was there. The feeling of being pursued only intensified as the ground grew softer beneath him, threatening to pull him under with every step. The swamps were closing in, and he had no clear path to escape. The trees around him began to thicken, the shadows deepening, and Jack's chest tightened with a growing sense of panic. The fog seemed to swirl around him, suffocating his every breath. His mind raced, but all he could focus on was that primal sense of being hunted, the invisible force chasing him relentlessly, just a few paces behind. Then came the snap of a branch, louder than any before. Closer. Jack froze. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. His breath caught in his throat, and the stillness was broken only by the sound of something massive shifting through the brush, unseen but undeniable. He spun around to face it, rifle raised. The creature, whatever it was close. Closer than ever. He could feel it, waiting, as the fog seemed to close in around him like a wall. There was no escape. The chase had begun. The swamp, once familiar in its isolation, now felt like a maze, a twisted labyrinth with no clear path forward. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he stumbled through the thick, soggy earth, his legs trembling from exhaustion. The sun, struggling to break through the dense fog, cast a weak, sickly light across the waterlogged ground, but the trees and mist swallowed most of it. He had been running for what felt like hours, but it was impossible to tell. The swamp's oppressive silence had returned, the sounds of the creature's pursuit now replaced by the pounding of his own heartbeat. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed forward, eyes darting nervously from side to side. At first, Jack had tried to follow the tracks, the claw marks that seemed to lead deeper into the swamp, but now, every tree, every root, every patch of ground seemed the same. The layout of the swamp had begun to shift, its contours warping in a way that defied logic. He turned a corner, expecting to find the same muddy trail, but instead found a dense thicket of reeds and tangled vines, where nothing had been moments before. Panic gripped him like a vice. His head spun as he realized he had no idea where he was anymore. The swamp had closed in around him. The trees towered higher now, their twisted branches stretching out like skeletal arms, blocking the sky above. The mist seemed thicker, heavier, as though it was closing in to smother him. The ground beneath him felt unstable, each step uncertain, and every direction seemed to lead to a dead end. He glanced back over his shoulder, but there was no sign of the creature. Yet, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, somewhere, in the shadows. Watching him. Waiting. He tried to force calmness into his thoughts, but the more he walked, the more disoriented he became. The swamp seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, an unending stretch of water and trees. No sign of the camp he'd set up earlier. No familiar markers. Just the same twisted scenery over and over, as if the land itself was shifting beneath his feet. "Think, Jack, think," he muttered to himself, desperation creeping into his voice. He stopped for a moment, catching his breath, and listened. Silence. Absolute silence. Not even the rustle of the wind through the trees. Nothing. It was then that the thought hit him, sharp and cold, this isn't just a swamp. Something was wrong. He wasn't just lost. He was trapped. The swamp wasn't simply confusing him, it was actively disorienting him. The trees, the water, the very land was shifting as though it had a mind of its own, keeping him from leaving. Jack's pulse quickened as a terrible realization sunk in. It wasn't just the creature that was hunting him. The swamp itself was part of it. He tried to force himself to remain rational, but his mind raced with increasingly irrational thoughts. Could the swamp be alive? Could it be part of the creature's territory, its domain? The thought was absurd, yet everything around him seemed to scream that something far darker than he had ever imagined was at work. He tried to calm his breathing and retrace his steps, but it was no use. Every tree seemed the same. Every turn led him deeper into the heart of the swamp. The fog seemed to pulse, alive with an eerie energy. Jack pressed forward, determined not to succumb to fear, but the deeper he went, the more the swamp seemed to close in, squeezing the very air from his lungs. There was no escape, no exit, no clear path back to where he had come from. And somewhere in the distance, just beyond the trees, he thought he heard a low growl, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this twisted place. Jack's chest tightened as he realized the truth. He was lost. And the swamp wasn't just his prison, it was hunting him, too. The air around Jack felt heavy, thick with the oppressive weight of the fog. Each breath he took was a struggle, as if the very swamp was pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. His mind raced, the rational thoughts slipping further away with every step, replaced by a creeping dread he couldn't escape. The deeper he ventured into the heart of the swamp, the more the fog seemed to close in, wrapping around him like a living thing. Every sound in the swamp was amplified, his own footsteps a dull squelch in the mud, his breathing loud in his ears. But beneath those sounds, there was something else. A rustle. A snap of twigs. Too deliberate to be the wind, too quick to be an animal. It was something following him, moving with purpose, but always just out of sight. Jack's eyes darted around, searching the mist, but the thick air obscured everything beyond a few feet. Another sound, this one different. A low, guttural growl. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, closer. The air seemed to hum with tension, vibrating in his chest. Jack froze, his pulse pounding in his ears, the rifle gripped tightly in his hands. He swallowed, his throat dry, and listened. The growl sounded again, but this time it was much closer. It wasn't just a growl, it was a series of clicks, sharp and rhythmic, like the sound of something gnashing its teeth. The sound seemed to come from all directions, reverberating through the trees and the thick fog, as if the creature was surrounding him. Jack's mind reeled with the impossibility of it. The growls and clicks didn't belong to any animal he had ever heard before. It was as though the swamp itself was alive, breathing with some ancient, primal hunger. He turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but the mist seemed to distort everything. Every time he thought he saw movement in the fog, it vanished. The silence would return for a moment, only to be shattered by another guttural noise. Jack's nerves were raw. His heart raced, his body tensed as he listened intently. The sounds were closing in on him, moving through the fog like an invisible force. The clicking was louder now, like claws scraping against stone or bones grinding together. But there was something unnerving about the rhythm of it, too perfect, too intentional. It was like the creature was playing with him, drawing out the fear. The fog swirled around Jack, a thick veil that seemed to distort everything. The trees were mere silhouettes, their twisted branches scraping the air, but every one of them seemed like a potential threat, an extension of whatever was out there in the mist. He could feel it in his bones. The thing that stalked him was no longer a distant fear. It was close, too close. He stumbled backward, the mud slippery beneath his boots. Every noise, every crack and rustle made him flinch. His grip tightened on the rifle, but the unease gnawing at him was unbearable. He couldn't see it, couldn't hear it in the same way, but he could feel it. It was all around him. Another growl. This time, it was not just a noise, it was a vibration that resonated deep in his chest, as if the very earth were growling in response. Jack's throat tightened. His eyes darted around, trying to find something, anything, that would tell him what was happening. But there was nothing. The fog, thick and suffocating, swallowed everything. And then, just as his sanity began to fray, the sound stopped. The swamp went quiet. For a brief, fleeting moment, Jack thought it was over. Perhaps the creature had grown bored of its game, or maybe, just maybe, it had moved on. He dared to take a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he wiped the sweat from his brow. But before he could move, he heard it. A single, unmistakable sound that froze him in his tracks. A slow, deliberate footstep. It was close, too close. Jack's heart skipped, and he spun around in panic, his eyes wide, but there was nothing in the fog, nothing but the oppressive silence, the echoes of his own breath. The creature was still out there. And it was waiting. The sound came again, closer now, impossibly close. It was the only sound in the swamp. The clicking, the growl, everything had been replaced by this one, slow, deliberate footstep. As if the creature was circling him, moving through the fog with patient precision, waiting for the moment to strike. Jack's skin crawled. His nerves were raw, stretched thin by the suffocating atmosphere of the swamp and the unrelenting terror creeping in from all sides. He had to move. He had to get out of here. But the mist was too thick, and the creature was closing in. He was no longer sure which way to go. He had no sense of direction. The swamp was alive with its own eerie rhythm, and Jack was caught in its grasp. The sounds of the chase had only just begun. Jack's legs burned, his body screaming for rest, but he couldn't stop. The footsteps, the clicking, the growls, it all pressed in on him. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He stumbled through the thick underbrush, trying to push past the dense fog, the swamp's twisted landscape closing in on him from all sides. He was losing his grip, his rational thoughts slipping further away with every step. Then, through the haze, something appeared, a dark silhouette among the trees. A structure, old and weathered, barely visible through the curtain of mist. It stood alone in a small clearing, its presence like a beacon in the endless fog. At first, Jack thought it might be a mirage, a trick of the swamp, but as he drew closer, the cabin became clearer, more solid. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, just a small, dilapidated shack, its rotting wood sagging under the weight of time and neglect. The door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, and the windows were boarded up with splintered planks. But it was a place to hide. Jack approached cautiously, his instinct screaming that it might be a trap, but desperation outweighed his fear. The clicking of the creature's claws echoed in the distance, but he didn't have time to wait. He needed shelter. He pushed open the door, which creaked ominously, sending a shiver down his spine. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the weak light filtering through the gaps in the walls. The air was stale and musty, the smell of mildew and decay heavy in his nostrils. It looked as if no one had been here for years, perhaps decades. Dust covered every surface, and the floor was littered with the remnants of broken furniture, pieces of old chairs, a collapsed table, and shattered glass. But it wasn't the abandoned nature of the cabin that made his blood run cold, it was the markings. As Jack stepped further into the cabin, his eyes were drawn to the walls. Scrawled across the decaying wood, in faded, uneven lines, were strange symbols, runic shapes, crude and jagged, carved deep into the timber. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though they were alive, waiting. Some were simple, like spirals and intersecting lines, while others looked more complex, almost alien. They were unlike anything Jack had ever seen. His breath caught in his throat as he traced one of the symbols with his eyes. It was as if the marks were meant to ward something off, or perhaps invite it in. The symbols seemed to grow darker as he stared at them, their edges blurring and shifting as if they were alive, reacting to his gaze. He stepped back, unease creeping through his chest. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his shoulder, but it did little to comfort him. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The markings on the wood seemed to be drawing him in, luring him deeper into the cabin. A low growl rose from outside. Jack froze. It was closer now, unmistakable, a rumble deep in the earth, vibrating through the very ground beneath him. His heart skipped in his chest as he turned toward the door. The creature was coming. Desperation took hold. He needed to hide. He scanned the cabin for a place to shelter himself. There was a small closet in the corner, its door half open, but before he could move, his gaze caught on something else, a large, old chest in the center of the room. It was an oddity in the otherwise barren space, its surface covered in more of those cryptic symbols. The wood was worn and cracked, but it seemed oddly solid compared to the rest of the cabin. Jack hesitated for a moment, but the growl outside came again, louder, closer. Without thinking, he rushed toward the chest. The latch was stiff, but after a moment of struggling, it gave way, creaking open with a sharp sound. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. But as Jack peered closer, he thought he saw something, a faint glimmer of movement. Something was shifting within the chest. His breath caught, and he stepped back, but the growl outside became more insistent, more desperate. He had no choice. Without thinking, Jack climbed into the chest, pulling the lid down behind him, enveloping himself in darkness. His breath was shallow, his heart racing, as the sounds of the swamp faded into the background. But as he lay there, hidden in the darkness, a strange thought crossed his mind. Had the creature been here before him? The markings, the strange symbols. Was this cabin part of something bigger? Something older? Jack's eyes snapped open in the pitch-black space. He could hear the faint rustling of something moving outside, and the sounds were growing closer, closer than ever. The hunt wasn't over yet. The creature was near. The air inside the chest was suffocating, heavy with the weight of Jack's fear. His heart hammered in his chest, the thud so loud it almost drowned out the faint sounds coming from outside. He held his breath, trying to keep as still as possible, his hand clenched around the rifle, fingers numb. The growls outside had stopped for a moment, but the silence was just as terrifying. It was the calm before the storm. Jack's eyes adjusted to the darkness, but even in the blackness, his mind kept playing tricks on him. Every creak of the wood, every distant rustle in the fog, made him tense, thinking the creature had found him. He could feel it, could almost sense the presence of something far beyond the realms of anything he had ever hunted. Something other. Suddenly, a sharp noise, a snapping twig, cut through the stillness. The creature was close. Closer than ever. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He strained to hear any sound, any sign of movement, but it was impossible to tell exactly where the creature was. The swamp had gone dead quiet again, as if the world itself had paused in anticipation. Jack's palms were slick with sweat as he gripped the rifle tighter, the weight of it reassuring, but only just. He needed to make a choice. Stay hidden, or face whatever was stalking him. The growls had stopped, but that only made the silence more ominous. Jack couldn't afford to wait any longer. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the chest lid, his hands trembling as he gently lifted it, just a crack. The faint light from the mist outside trickled in, casting long shadows across the floor of the cabin. Nothing. The creature hadn't made a move yet. But Jack knew it was waiting. He hesitated for just a second longer, listening intently for any sound, but then it came, the unmistakable thud of a heavy footfall. Right outside the cabin. Jack's pulse skyrocketed. The sound was so loud, so deliberate, it was as if the creature was testing the air, feeling the cabin for weakness. Another step. Then another. The growl he'd heard earlier echoed again, louder this time, closer. The creature was circling, sizing him up. It knew he was inside. His mind raced, thoughts tumbling over each other. He was trapped. He had no way out. The swamp was thick with mist, the trees were like sentinels, and the cabin offered little more than a temporary respite. But maybe it wasn't just a refuge. Maybe it could be a weapon. Jack's fingers tightened on the rifle. He couldn't just sit here and wait. He needed to fight, to make a stand. His eyes scanned the cabin for anything useful, anything that might give him an edge. The chest. The symbols. He had no idea what they meant, but they had to mean something. Were they warnings? Traps? Or perhaps protection? But there was no time to think about it. The creature was getting closer. Its growls now reverberated through the floorboards, like the growl of an animal too large to be real. The sound was like thunder, deep, bone-shaking, and impossible to ignore. Move. Without thinking, Jack crawled out of the chest, rifle in hand. He crouched low, keeping himself hidden behind the remnants of broken furniture. The creature's shadow stretched across the cabin, a dark shape that barely seemed to fit within the room. It moved with unnatural grace, its limbs elongated and twisted, like a predator out of some primal nightmare. Jack couldn't see it fully, but he could feel it. Its presence loomed, suffocating him. Then, suddenly, the creature stopped. Its head turned sharply toward him, and Jack felt his breath freeze in his throat. It had sensed him, felt his movements. There was no time left. Jack raised his rifle, hand steady despite the rising panic, and aimed at the doorway. His fingers trembled as he waited for the right moment. The creature's movements were so quick, so precise, that he knew one wrong move could be his last. The moment the creature stepped into view, Jack fired. The shot rang out with an ear-splitting crack, but the creature didn't flinch. It moved so fast, so fluidly, that it seemed to glide across the cabin, avoiding the bullet with impossible agility. Jack barely had time to process what was happening before the creature lunged. A blur of motion, a flash of teeth, claws, and dark fur hurtled at him, and Jack was thrown backward. His rifle flew from his hands as he collided with the wall, pain exploding through his ribs. He gasped for air, disoriented. But the creature wasn't done. It loomed over him, its face a grotesque mixture of man and beast, eyes glowing with a sickly yellow hue. Its breath was foul, its growls vibrating through the floor as it leaned in closer. Jack could see its teeth now, jagged and razor-sharp, a mockery of nature. He had only moments to react. In a desperate move, Jack kicked out, his boots connecting with the creature's chest. It staggered back, momentarily disoriented. Jack scrambled for his rifle, his hands shaking with adrenaline, but before he could get a firm grip, the creature lunged again. This time, Jack was ready. With a grunt, he slammed the barrel of the rifle into the creature's face, pushing it back. It screeched an otherworldly, bone-chilling sound, and Jack could feel the vibration in his teeth. He didn't stop. He fired again. The creature recoiled, but this time the shot landed. A low, guttural scream echoed through the cabin as the beast stumbled, its body writhing in pain. Jack didn't wait. With the creature distracted, he pushed himself up, the rifle now in both hands, his aim steady. The final shot rang out, deafening in the confined space. The creature fell backward, crashing into the cabin's floor with a tremendous thud. For a moment, the swamp was silent. Jack's chest heaved, his heart racing, as he cautiously approached the fallen creature. It was motionless, its eyes wide and vacant, the glow slowly fading from them. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood over the thing that had hunted him for so long. But even as he caught his breath, a horrible realization sank in: the fight wasn't over. The swamp itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next step in the hunt to begin. The moment Jack took a step back from the fallen creature, the silence of the cabin seemed to collapse around him. His heart was still racing, but a deep, primal instinct pushed him into motion. He couldn't linger here. The beast might be down, but the swamp wasn't finished with him. His hands shook violently as he grabbed the rifle, forcing it back into his grip. He had no time to think, no time to plan. All he knew was that he needed to get out, now. He turned toward the door, his breath shallow as he sprinted across the cabin. Each step was frantic, urgent. His legs burned, but the adrenaline kept him moving. The door was a mere few feet away, but the very ground beneath him felt like it was shifting, pulling him into some unseen pit. Then came the sound. A growl, lower and deeper than before, reverberated through the cabin. It wasn't over. The creature wasn't dead. It couldn't be. Jack didn't dare look back. He was already at the door, slamming it open with force. The hinges screamed in protest, and the stale air of the swamp rushed in, heavy with moisture and decay. He didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he dashed into the mist, pushing through the dense, wet foliage. The creature's growl was louder now, more visceral. It was on his trail. It had recovered faster than he anticipated, and now it was pursuing him. Jack's feet pounded against the swamp's uneven ground, the thick muck sucking at his boots. He was slowing, but the fear kept him moving, kept him sprinting through the fog as fast as he could. His mind raced, no plan, no destination, just the desperate need to outrun the nightmare behind him. Behind him, the creature's movement was swift, like a flash of darkness cutting through the mist. Jack could hear it drawing closer, its footfalls as rhythmic and steady as his own, but far louder. Each growl seemed to shake the earth beneath him. It was relentless. The creature was relentless. The mist swirled around him, thickening, blurring his vision. He couldn't tell where he was, where he had been, or if there was any safe place left to hide. Everything was a maze of shadows, twisted trees, and the oppressive sound of his own breath mingling with the beast's growls. Suddenly, a cold sensation rippled down his spine. It was the kind of fear that paralyzes, that tells you something is wrong even before you see it. Jack stumbled, nearly falling as a shadow flashed across his path. The creature had anticipated his movement, cutting him off. It had been here the whole time. Jack's heart leapt into his throat. He pivoted, aiming for the thickest part of the swamp, the deepest, most inhospitable terrain, hoping the beast's size would slow it down. He was gasping for air, his legs moving on instinct, desperate for a way out. The creature's growls grew closer, now almost deafening. It was right on his heels. Jack could feel the heat of its breath, hear its claws scraping the earth just inches away from his back. His foot slipped. He cursed and tried to regain his balance, but the swamp had other plans. The mud gave way beneath him, and he plunged, face first, into the muck. The rifle flew from his hands, and for a brief moment, all he could hear was the sickening squelch of his body sinking deeper into the swamp. He fought, scrambling to rise, but the thick mud was like quicksand, holding him in place. The creature's growls turned into something else, higher pitched, more frenzied. It was closing in, and there was no escape. Jack's breath came in sharp gasps as he clawed at the ground, his hands slipping in the thick muck. He forced himself upright, hands reaching desperately for anything to steady him. His chest ached from the exertion, and his head was spinning. The creature burst through the trees ahead of him. Jack barely had time to react. It was impossibly fast, faster than anything he ever encountered. Its monstrous form towered over him, casting a shadow that made him feel like an insect beneath the foot of a giant. It was almost too fast to process, its body a blur of muscle and rage. The beast was inhuman, its face contorted in a snarl, yellow eyes gleaming with unbridled hunger. For the first time, Jack felt true terror. Not just the fear of being hunted, but the fear of absolute helplessness. The creature lunged at him. Jack barely managed to dodge, the beast's claws swiping through the air, missing him by mere inches. But the momentum of the beast's attack sent him tumbling backward into the swamp's waters. Cold shock rippled through him as he splashed into the murky depths, but there was no time to feel the chill. He pushed himself to his feet, water rushing around him, but the creature was already closing in. Jack's mind was racing, flee or fight. But he knew there was no fighting this thing, not with a rifle, not with anything. His eyes darted wildly across the swamp, seeking anything that could help, any escape, but the fog twisted and curled around him, hiding everything but the beast's glowing eyes. There was no choice. Run. Jack forced his body to move, scrambling through the water, the sound of his heart pounding in his ears as the creature's growls grew closer, louder. He could hear its claws snapping against the earth, the heavy weight of its pursuit pressing down on him with every step he took. He couldn't stop. He couldn't slow down. But the swamp seemed endless, its grasp unyielding, and no matter how fast he ran, the creature was always just a step behind. The swamp was changing. It had always been a maze of thick fog, twisted trees, and murky waters, but now it felt alive. Jack could no longer tell where he had been or where he was going. The landscape seemed to shift, as though the swamp itself was conspiring against him, guiding him deeper into its heart. His breath was ragged as he pushed forward through the underbrush, his clothes soaked and his body heavy with exhaustion. Every step felt like wading through quicksand. He had no sense of time anymore. Had it been hours? Days? The world around him was smothered in thick mist, and the shadows of the trees loomed like towering, silent sentinels. The air was suffocating, each breath laced with the acrid scent of decay and dampness. He stopped for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts, but the overwhelming stillness pressed in on him. The swamp's silence was more oppressive than its sounds. It felt wrong, as if the very earth beneath him was watching, listening, waiting. Jack rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fog from his mind. This isn't real. He had to remind himself that it wasn't. He had to remind himself that the creature wasn't real. But the longer he stayed in the swamp, the more the lines between reality and nightmare blurred. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes felt like the creature was drawing closer. And yet, when he turned to face the noise, there was never anything there, just the cold, mocking emptiness of the swamp. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, trying to ward off the chill that seeped into his bones. His skin felt clammy and wet, though the air was warm and stifling. The weight of his rifle in his hands was the only anchor to reality left. But even that was starting to feel distant. Jack's vision blurred. Was it exhaustion? Or was the swamp doing something to him? The fog shifted unnaturally, swirling in patterns that didn't make sense. He tried to focus, tried to keep track of the shapes that drifted in and out of the mist, but they never seemed to stay in place. Trees loomed ahead and behind him, their branches twisting into grotesque forms, faces, mouths, eyes. Every shadow seemed to stretch and shift with a life of its own. "You're losing it, Jack." He shook his head, trying to steady himself, but the disorientation was overwhelming. The world around him felt as if it was folding in on itself, the lines between land and sky blending into an indistinguishable haze. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stop. His mind was racing now, spiraling into confusion. The creature was still out there, he was sure of it, but was it following him, or was it just his mind playing tricks? Could it be the swamp itself driving him mad? Was there really anything in the fog, or was he just imagining it all? This isn't real. It can't be real. His own thoughts betrayed him. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was missing, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The swamp no longer felt like a place. It felt like a prison, a cage of his own mind, slowly closing in around him. Every sound now seemed amplified, his footsteps, the rustling of leaves, the distant croak of a frog, all distorted and strange. His vision danced with shapes, too many of them, too fast, like flickering images in a dream. The shadows stretched longer, curling and twisting into shapes he couldn't comprehend. I need to find the way out. I need to get out. But no matter how far he ran, no matter how much he struggled, the swamp never seemed to end. The trees crowded closer, the fog thickened, and the ground beneath him became more treacherous, as if the very earth was conspiring to keep him here. Jack's pulse quickened as the paranoia set in. His breath caught in his throat, his chest tight with fear. He was trapped. There was no escape. He stumbled forward, his mind racing, but the more he moved, the more the swamp seemed to press in. Every corner he turned revealed more of the same endless trees, dense fog, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. His vision swam. The trees ahead seemed to blur and stretch, their trunks warping into strange, indistinct forms. He blinked, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but the trees, were they moving? He couldn't tell. Was he losing his mind, or was something else at work here? Jack's hands gripped his rifle tighter, but it felt heavier now. Useless. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow, just beyond the mist. A figure moving quickly between the trees. His heart lurched. The creature. Was it really there? Was it real? Or was it just another trick of his mind? Jack froze, staring into the fog. His breath hitched, his pulse racing. His body wanted to move, but his legs felt like lead. Every muscle in his body screamed to run, but his mind couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was gone, vanished into the mist like smoke. But Jack couldn't shake the image from his mind. His thoughts were spiraling out of control now, no longer grounded in reality. He was losing his grip. The swamp was consuming him. The creature was everywhere, even if it wasn't. I have to leave. I have to get out of here. But Jack couldn't remember which way was the right way. Jack's heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment, the world around him felt as if it had stopped. The silence was all-encompassing, suffocating. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each inhale too quick, too desperate. The fog hung like a dense, suffocating blanket, pressing on him from all sides, muting the world to nothing but his own panicked thoughts. Then, through the mist, he saw it. A shadow. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, a blur of movement that could have been anything. The way the trees twisted in the fog, how the shadows shifted. But there was no mistaking it now. The figure was too large, too unnatural. Jack's pulse quickened, and his legs locked in place, paralyzed by fear. It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't the fog playing tricks. The creature was there. It was moving. Slowly at first, stalking, gliding through the trees. Jack could just make out the outline of its grotesque shape, a massive form shifting in the fog, too fluid to be human. The creature was still far enough away that Jack could almost convince himself it wasn't real, but the dread that crawled up his spine told him otherwise. He could feel the eyes on him, cold and predatory, even from a distance. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee in the opposite direction, but his legs refused to obey. It was like the very air was charged with something, a presence that held him in place. The creature was moving toward him, its form becoming clearer with every passing moment, its outline now unmistakable, tall, hunched, with unnatural limbs that stretched and twisted in ways no human body could. It was gaining ground. Jack took a step back, his foot sinking into the mud, but it was too late. The creature had already taken notice. A low growl rumbled through the air, guttural and deep, vibrating the very ground beneath him. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the pulse of the creature's presence. Now, the very air thick with its malevolence. The fog parted slightly, and there it was, its twisted face emerging from the shadows. Two yellow eyes gleamed from the darkness, and a twisted mouth stretched wide, showing rows of jagged teeth. It was hungry. Every muscle in Jack's body locked in fear. His mind raced, but it wasn't rational anymore. His thoughts were disjointed, lost in the panic that had taken root deep within him. The creature was moving closer. The ground beneath Jack's feet felt softer now, like the swamp was trying to swallow him whole. He tried to make his legs work, to take a step backward, but his body betrayed him, frozen in place. The creature's growls echoed through the fog, louder now, almost mocking. It was enjoying this. Jack forced himself to look away, forcing his legs to move even though they felt like they were made of stone. One step, then another. He stumbled, almost falling, but managed to keep his balance. But the creature wasn't done. The growl escalated into a snarl. The figure moved faster now, its limbs bending and twisting unnaturally as it closed the gap between them. Jack could feel the air shift. The creature was behind him now, no longer just a shadow in the fog. He didn't dare turn around, but he could sense the weight of its presence, its every movement sending a chill crawling up his spine. It was close enough to touch. Close enough to feel the heat of its breath on the back of his neck. A sound broke through the air, a snap of twigs, a shift in the branches, and Jack's head whipped around. He saw it, clear as day now. The creature was no longer just a shape in the fog. It was right there, standing tall and looming, its features sharp and grotesque. It was almost human in its form, but its limbs stretched too long, its skin too pale, its face too distorted to belong to any creature of nature. A deep, guttural growl ripped through the silence, and Jack's body responded before his mind could process it. His legs moved in a burst of frantic energy, propelling him forward through the swamp, the thick mud trying to suck him back, the weight of his body pulling him into the earth. But the creature was faster. Its claws scraped against the ground, its long, unnatural limbs closing in on Jack with terrifying speed. He heard it before he saw it, a snap of bone, a shift in the air, and then a roar. A roar that reverberated through the fog and shook the very trees around him. The swamp was alive now, alive with the sound of his fear, the creature's pursuit, and the crushing weight of his isolation. Jack's breath was ragged, every part of him screaming to run, but his legs were growing weaker, his body betraying him with every step. It wasn't just a chase anymore. It was the creature's hunt. And Jack was its prey. Jack's breath was heavy, ragged, as he stumbled into the abandoned cabin, slamming the door behind him with a desperate force. His hands shook, and his heart was pounding in his chest as though it was trying to escape. The creature was out there, just beyond the walls, its growls still echoing through the air like distant thunder. The cabin felt suffocating, the air thick with dust and the faint, acrid scent of mildew. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor creaked with each step Jack took. But the cabin, for all its decaying isolation, felt like the only place he could find some semblance of safety, at least for the moment. He leaned against the wall, breathing in deep, trying to calm the panic that was spiraling out of control. His hands gripped his rifle so tightly that his knuckles were white, but he wasn't sure how much protection it would offer against whatever was hunting him. He didn't know if he was still hallucinating or if the creature was real, but every part of him screamed that it was, that something unnatural was stalking him through the fog. Through the dim light, he scanned the room. Dust-covered furniture, broken windows, and scattered remnants of the past. It looked like no one had lived here in years, decades, maybe, but there was something about the room that felt wrong. A sense of foreboding lingered in the corners, the walls as if they were whispering secrets just out of reach. Jack's eyes landed on an old wooden desk in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers, books, and a small, leather-bound journal. His pulse quickened as he moved toward it, unsure if he was just being paranoid or if the journal could offer some kind of explanation for what was happening to him. He snatched it up with trembling hands, its worn cover creaking as he flipped it open. The first pages were faded, the ink smeared and nearly illegible, but as he turned the pages, the writing became clearer. The words were filled with madness, and as Jack read them, a cold shiver ran down his spine. I found it today. The creature. It is not like anything I've ever seen, not like any beast that should live in these swamps. It moves faster than a man, but it is not man. It is something else, something born of the darkness in these swamps. The locals tell stories, but no one believes them anymore. No one believes the swamp is alive, that the creature is a curse, an ancient thing that feeds on the fear of those who enter its domain. Jack's hands began to tremble as he read further. The journal entries painted a grim picture, one of a creature born not of flesh and bone, but of some dark force that had tainted the land itself. It was a creature of the swamp, of shadows and nightmares, a thing that had existed for generations, long before Jack had set foot here. It watches. It waits. And when it feels the fear of its prey, it moves. It's not the way an animal hunts, it feeds on terror, the helplessness of its victims. That's why it's drawn to the swamp. It feeds on the fear of the lost, the isolated, the ones who think they are safe, but know they are not. I've tried to escape, but it is relentless. The swamp keeps changing, and so does the creature. It adapts. It knows you better than you know yourself. Jack felt his throat tighten as he read the chilling words. The creature was no mere beast, it was something far worse. It was a manifestation of fear itself, a creature that thrived on the terror of its prey. And it was stalking him, watching him. I tried to leave the swamp. I thought I had escaped. But I see its eyes in the fog. I hear its steps in the silence. It is following me. And it will never stop until it has claimed me. I am writing this down as a warning. You who read these words, don't enter the swamp. It will take you. It will never let you leave. The final entry was barely legible, the ink smeared with something dark, something that looked like blood. The last words were written in jagged strokes, as if the writer had been desperate to finish the journal before being consumed by the creature. Jack's mind raced, processing the implications of what he had just read. The creature was real. It wasn't just an animal, it was something far more dangerous, a creature that lived off the fear of those who entered the swamp, who became lost in its endless fog. Jack had unwittingly walked into its territory, and now he was its prey. But what did the journal mean by it adapts? Was it talking about the creature's ability to stalk, to hunt in ways that defied reason? Was it able to learn its prey? He couldn't focus. His thoughts were spinning, spiraling into chaos. He slammed the journal shut and shoved it into his bag, but his heart wasn't in the action. He wasn't safe. He knew that now. The creature was out there. And it was getting closer. The air in the cabin felt thick, charged with an unseen presence. The creature was still nearby. He could feel it, sense it in the oppressive silence that had filled the cabin. Jack knew he couldn't stay here forever. But with every passing second, it felt like the walls of the cabin were closing in on him. I need to leave. I need to find a way out. But the swamp, the creature, and the horrors it carried had already begun to invade his mind. Jack couldn't escape it. Not anymore. The oppressive silence of the cabin felt heavier now, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting. Jack's mind raced, but his body felt numb, as if the weight of what he'd read in the journal had stolen every ounce of strength from him. He wasn't safe here, not for long. The creature was coming. With trembling hands, he shoved the journal into his pack and hoisted it over his shoulder, the weight of it a reminder of the gravity of his situation. He had to move. He had to get out of the cabin before it was too late. He crept to the window and peered out through a crack in the rotting wood. The fog was thick, swirling around the trees like a living thing, and for a moment he saw nothing. But he didn't trust the silence. The swamp had become a predator's den, and every inch of it seemed to be alive, watching, waiting. Then, just as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw it. A figure. It was so swift, so fluid, that for a moment, Jack wasn't sure if it was real. The creature's form flashed between the trees, a massive shadow that seemed to glide rather than walk, its long limbs stretching unnaturally as it moved. Its eyes gleamed like twin lanterns in the dark fog, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was so fast, so impossibly fast, it was as though the very air around it bent to its will. His heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, Jack considered bolting from the cabin, running into the swamp. But the creature was already moving closer. He could feel it. Its presence was like a storm building in the distance, ready to tear everything apart. His hand was still on the window frame, his body frozen, his instinct screaming at him to move, to do something, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure in the distance. He had seen it before, but never this close. It was like watching a nightmare come to life, its features blurred in the mist, but still terrifying. Jack knew that if the creature saw him now, it would be over. It was too fast, too cunning. The wind picked up, and for a moment, a low, guttural growl reached Jack's ears. It came from behind him, from the direction of the door. His blood ran cold, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The creature was circling him. It was no longer just hunting, it was toying with him. Jack spun around, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. His hands were slick with sweat, his fingers unsteady as he tried to load the weapon. Every second felt like an eternity. The door shuddered under the force of a sudden blow from the outside, a low thud that sent a ripple of fear through Jack's body. It was testing him. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the scrape of claws against wood. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had to act now. He wasn't going to survive if he didn't make a move, if he didn't stop the creature from closing in. He darted to the back of the cabin, his feet barely making a sound on the creaky floorboards. There was a small window there, one that had been left cracked open, and Jack quickly pried it open, his eyes scanning the dark swamp beyond. The fog clung to the trees like smoke, but he could see the faint outline of the creature just beyond the tree line, its form moving with unsettling grace. Without thinking, Jack pushed through the window and stumbled out into the swamp, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. His breath caught in his throat as the creature's growl rumbled again, closer this time, right outside the cabin. It had found him. It was no longer playing games, it was coming for him, and it was fast. His legs burned as he sprinted, pushing through the thick mud and underbrush, his mind screaming at him to keep moving, to keep running. He could hear the creature now, its rapid footfalls crunching through the leaves, the sound of its claws scraping against the earth. It was gaining on him. Jack's heart was pounding in his ears as he pushed himself harder, but the creature's speed was unimaginable. He could hear it right behind him, each step a terrifying reminder that it was right there, that it could take him in an instant. The ground beneath him felt like it was swallowing him whole, his feet sinking into the muck with every stride. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was no time to react, only the blur of movement as the creature closed in. He felt a gust of wind, cold and sharp, brush past him, and for a brief, horrible moment, he thought the creature had reached out and grabbed him. His heart nearly stopped. But when he looked again, the creature was still just out of reach, its massive shadow stretching across the ground, its claws scraping the earth with a sound like nails on glass. It was only a matter of time. He knew that. The creature was relentless, its speed too much for Jack to outrun. It was only playing with him now, toying with his fear, slowly closing in. He stumbled again, this time falling to the ground, his rifle slipping from his grasp. He heard the creature's growl again, closer, too close, and the sensation of being watched, of being hunted, flooded his senses. The creature was mere inches away now, its hot breath on the back of his neck, its claws just out of reach. He could feel it, the heavy weight of its presence pressing down on him. In that moment, Jack knew that if he didn't act, he would never have another chance. Desperation clawed at him, and Jack did the only thing he could. He leaped to his feet, spinning around to face the creature head-on. The fog parted for just a moment, enough for Jack to see the glowing eyes of the creature, cold, predatory, calculating. He raised his rifle, aiming for what he could only hope was its head. But before he could fire, the creature lunged. Its massive claws swiped through the air, knocking the rifle from Jack's hands, sending it skittering across the ground. The impact sent Jack sprawling to the mud, gasping for air, his body pinned under the weight of the creature's shadow. It was over. Jack's chest heaved, and his body screamed in pain as the creature loomed over him, its towering figure blotting out what little light remained in the fog-choked swamp. The hot, rancid breath of the creature was a suffocating cloud, mingling with the damp, earthy scent of the swamp. Every instinct in Jack's body told him that this was it, that his time had run out. But a small, flickering flame of defiance still burned in his chest. No. I can't die here. Not like this. His heart was racing, but his mind was oddly calm. He knew he had mere moments before the creature finished him off, but that didn't stop him from thinking, from trying to make a plan. His rifle had been knocked from his grip, lying just beyond reach. His hands were shaking too violently to grab it, and even if he could, the creature's speed would make the shot impossible. He was lying flat on the ground, staring up at the creature, trying to make sense of its movements. It crouched low over him, its long arms stretching out like the branches of some ancient tree, its claws sharp and glistening in the dim light. It was toying with him now, its glowing eyes fixed on him with an unnerving focus. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. He couldn't feel his legs. Every inch of his body felt like lead, weighed down by the oppressive presence of the creature, by the crushing realization that he was at the end of the line. The creature's growl vibrated in the air around him, reverberating through his bones, its form a terrifying blur in the fog. Jack tried to steady his breath, to calm his thoughts. There has to be a way out. Think. His eyes darted around, searching desperately for anything, any advantage. He was surrounded by nothing but thick mud, dense fog, and the hulking shape of the creature. But then, his gaze landed on something small, insignificant, but it was something. The creature's claws were only inches from his face, but he saw the faint outline of a sharp, jagged branch sticking out of the mud beside him. It was his only shot. It's now or never. With every ounce of willpower he had left, Jack reached out with a trembling hand, stretching his fingers toward the branch. His skin scraped against the rough ground as he slid his hand along the muck, inching closer to the weapon. The creature's low growl grew louder, its hot breath on his skin as it leaned in closer. The air seemed to thicken with every passing second, as though time itself was closing in on him. Come on, just a little farther. His fingers brushed the edge of the branch, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow. Jack's hand wrapped around the sharp wood, the jagged end pressing against his palm. He gripped it tightly, knowing that the second he moved, it would be over. The creature would end him, and there would be no chance to fight back. But Jack had no choice. He couldn't die like this. Not here. Not at the mercy of a creature that thrived on fear. He pushed his body into a frantic, final surge of strength, rolling quickly to the side, using the momentum to shove the jagged branch into the creature's face. The sharp end sank deep into the soft flesh beneath the creature's glowing eyes, and a bone-chilling screech echoed through the swamp. The creature recoiled, jerking back in pain, its claws swiping at the air in blind fury. Jack scrambled to his feet, his body trembling, his heart pounding in his chest as the creature hissed in pain, its dark figure swaying. The fog seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, as if the swamp itself were closing in to swallow them both. But Jack didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes burning with hatred and fury. It was blinded by the strike, but it was still fast, still powerful, and Jack knew it wouldn't take long for it to recover. His only chance was to run. He bolted. The swamp seemed to stretch on endlessly before him, its darkness swallowing him whole as he fought through the thick mud and underbrush. Every step felt like he was moving through quicksand, the weight of the swamp dragging at his every movement. He could hear the creature behind him now, the sound of its claws scraping against the ground, its growls growing louder with each passing second. It was close. Too close. His legs burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The fog clung to his skin, the cold moisture sinking into his bones. He had no plan, no direction, just an overwhelming instinct to keep moving, to survive. But the swamp was a maze, and Jack was lost within it. The more he ran, the more disoriented he became. The trees, the ground, the very air, all of it felt wrong, as if the swamp itself was shifting, changing, turning against him. His mind was clouded, his thoughts fragmented. The creature was still behind him. He could feel its presence, just out of reach but always there, stalking him, waiting for him to falter. Jack couldn't stop. He couldn't. The fog parted for a brief moment, and in that fleeting moment of clarity, Jack saw something. A faint light in the distance. A house. A beacon, a potential safe haven. It was far, but it was his only hope. He pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain, the fear, the voice in his head telling him to stop. He wasn't going to stop. Not until he reached that light. With every ounce of energy he had left, Jack ran. The swamp had become a labyrinth of endless mud, thick brush, and twisted trees that seemed to shift and contort with every step Jack took. His legs were sore, his chest burning with each labored breath, but he couldn't afford to stop. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the fog, hunting him with a relentless precision. It knew his every move, his every hesitation. Jack's eyes darted from side to side as he trudged through the muck, his boots sinking deeper into the ground with every step. The thick fog swallowed him whole, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. The sounds of the swamp, chirping insects, croaking frogs, and the distant rustle of leaves felt deafening in the silence between his steps, each one amplified by the oppressive atmosphere. The swamp wasn't just a physical maze, it was a mental one too, warping his sense of direction. Jack could feel the labyrinth closing in on him, the land twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Wasn't I just here? His mind screamed at him that something was wrong. The same moss-covered tree had appeared at least 3 times now, its twisted roots gnawed like the fingers of some ancient creature reaching out for him. The path was growing more treacherous. The ground beneath him was soft and unstable, each step a gamble. The air was thick with moisture, the humidity making it difficult to breathe, and the fog, always that damn fog, seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. His pace slowed, each step becoming more deliberate as he tried to maintain his bearings. His heart hammered in his chest, and though he knew that every moment spent out here was a moment closer to his demise, he couldn't help but feel that the swamp itself was toying with him, guiding him deeper into its grasp. The fog pressed in around him, suffocating him. He couldn't hear the creature anymore. Maybe it had stopped following him. But he didn't dare relax. The silence was just as dangerous as the growls and snarls of the thing stalking him. It was a waiting game now. It knew he was here, and Jack knew he couldn't outrun it forever. He stumbled over a fallen log and cursed under his breath. Every move was becoming harder. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes. His muscles burned from exhaustion, and his mind, clouded by fear and desperation, kept telling him to stop, to just collapse and let it end. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and forced himself to move forward. The faint glow of the distant house, his only hope, was still visible through the haze of fog, but it seemed so far away now. The swamp stretched on endlessly, like some living creature intent on dragging him deeper into its belly. Every turn, every step, led him further into its heart, and Jack knew that the deeper he went, the less likely he was to find an escape. The trees around him were thick and knotted, their branches twisting together like arms reaching out to trap him. He could feel the oppressive weight of the swamp pressing down on him, the walls of the labyrinth closing in tighter, the path narrowing with every step. His mind raced, each thought a frantic attempt to make sense of the madness around him. Where was the house? How much farther? It has to be close. A sudden crack of a branch snapped through the silence, and Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat. That sound, sharp, clear, and unmistakable, could only mean one thing: the creature was still behind him. It was waiting, watching. Every move, every step he took was being tracked. Jack's stomach churned with dread, and for a split second, he thought he could feel the ground shifting beneath him, as though the swamp itself was alive and aware of his every thought. His hand shot up, gripping a branch for support as he navigated the treacherous terrain, his heart racing even faster. His mind screamed at him to run, to keep moving, but he didn't know where to go. The fog was a suffocating shroud, the trees like specters in the mist, and Jack had no sense of direction. It was as though the swamp was feeding on his fear, twisting the landscape to keep him off balance, trapping him in its grasp. The low, guttural growl of the creature echoed through the swamp. Jack's blood ran cold, his muscles locked in place as the creature's voice vibrated in his chest. It was too close. He could feel it, smell it, like wet earth and decay. The creature was no longer a distant threat. It was right on top of him. In a panic, Jack surged forward, crashing through the underbrush, his breath ragged and frantic. His thoughts became a blur. The swamp had turned into a never-ending series of nightmares, each moment more maddening than the last. His every step felt heavier, the ground beneath him sinking deeper with each frantic push. The trees around him seemed to close in, their dark, twisted forms creating an impenetrable wall of shadow. It's got me. It's going to get me. The thought reverberated in his mind, but Jack pushed it away. There was no time for doubt. There was no time for fear. He had to move. And then, suddenly, the fog parted. Through the shifting mist, Jack saw it, the house. A small, dilapidated shack, barely standing, but it was a place of refuge, a place where he could make one last stand. Without thinking, Jack rushed forward, his body moving on pure instinct, driven by the raw, animal need to survive. The house seemed to grow larger with each step, the mist parting like curtains drawn back to reveal his salvation. His eyes never left the shack. He was almost there. And then, the ground beneath him gave way. The swamp, which had been his enemy from the start, had finally claimed him. Jack's feet slipped on the slick, muddy ground as he continued to push through the swamp, his legs trembling from exhaustion. He had been running, stumbling, for what felt like hours, each step more frantic than the last. The distant light of the shack was now a fading memory behind him, swallowed by the oppressive fog and the labyrinth of trees. His mind was a fog, clouded by the overwhelming fear that gripped him, and yet, a part of him couldn't help but notice how the swamp seemed to grow quieter, more oppressive, with every passing moment. The usual sounds of the swamp, the chirps, the rustling of leaves, the croaks of unseen creatures, had all but ceased. The air was thick, and the oppressive silence felt heavier now, pressing on him from all sides. It's coming. It's closer. He could feel it. The presence of the creature, its relentless pursuit, seemed to be drawing near. He could almost taste the fear in the air, thick as the humidity that clung to his skin. Every crack of a twig, every creak of a tree branch, made his heart race. The creature was closing in. There was no doubt now. But then, something shifted in the air. A faint, metallic scent lingered in the thick mist, faint but undeniable. The ground beneath his feet seemed different here, less soggy, more solid, as if the very earth itself had become unnatural. Jack took a hesitant step forward, drawn by the strange pull, even as a voice in his head screamed at him to turn around and run. But it was too late for that now, wasn't it? He couldn't outrun the creature, and maybe, just maybe, this place held some clue, some way to end this madness. As he pushed through the mist, the ground beneath him began to rise, the terrain shifting into an unnatural incline. He could feel the air change as he neared whatever was ahead of him. And then, just as the fog parted once more, he saw it. The lair. It wasn't a den in the traditional sense, no cozy burrow or hollow in the ground. This was something far darker, far more sinister. The ground was stained with dark, dried blood, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Jagged, twisted trees surrounded a large open area, forming a grotesque ring. Piles of bones, some human, some animal, littered the ground in every direction, a grim testament to the creature's insatiable hunger. The bones were scattered in piles, carelessly heaped together, their white, brittle fragments glistening in the dim light that managed to pierce the fog. Some of the bones were half mangled, chewed and gnawed in ways that turned Jack's stomach. He could make out what looked like the remains of other hunters, clothing shredded and half-eaten, dark stains soaking into the earth. The hair and clothing still clung to the bones in some places, giving Jack the sickening realization that these were once people, just like him. How many had this thing killed? He stepped further into the lair, his every instinct screaming for him to turn around and run. But the pull of the place, the overwhelming sense that this was the center of it all, kept him rooted in place. There was something about the lair, something that felt wrong in the very marrow of his bones. As he scanned the area, his gaze landed on something that made his heart drop into his stomach. A half-rotted carcass, its twisted form barely recognizable as a human body, was pinned to a tree in the center of the lair. The body was nearly skeletal, covered in dirt and muck, but what made Jack's stomach churn was the sheer unnaturalness of the thing. The body had been hung here, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its face frozen in a horrific, wide-eyed expression. The flesh had been torn away in places, leaving only bone and sinew. But what was most disturbing were the claws, massive, jagged slashes along the skin where something had dug deep, pulling at the meat like a hungry animal. The wounds were fresh, raw, as though the creature had been feeding on this body just moments ago. The realization hit Jack like a physical blow. This was the creature's home, its hunting ground. This was where it brought its prey, where it tormented and fed on them before discarding them as nothing more than meat and bone. It's like a sick trophy room. But there was no time to dwell on that now. His senses sharpened as a sound cut through the silence, a low, guttural growl, almost a purr, coming from behind him. Jack froze, every muscle in his body going rigid. It was close. So close. A pair of glowing yellow eyes appeared in the fog, watching him with an unnatural intensity. The creature was here, in its domain, and it was aware of his presence. The air seemed to crackle with tension as Jack's heart slammed against his ribs. The creature's growl grew louder, its steps coming closer. The darkness of the swamp had swallowed the light, leaving him in a shifting, unrelenting haze of fog and dread. And then, the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the ground echoed through the lair. The creature was moving, and it was moving fast. Jack's blood ran cold. There's nowhere to run. He was trapped in the creature's territory now, its lair, its hunting ground. And in the midst of all the bones, the shredded remnants of past victims, Jack understood the full extent of the creature's power. It was no longer just a creature of speed and fury. It was a hunter, a predator that had honed its skills in this very place, using the swamp as its hunting ground, its domain. Jack's breath quickened, panic rising as he realized the creature was circling, stalking him from the shadows. Every moment was a heartbeat away from the final attack. The swamp was alive. And now, Jack was its prey. The fog swirled around Jack, dense and thick, reducing the world to shadows and shapes. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the swamp pressing down on him with each passing second. His mind was a chaotic blur of panic and disbelief as he faced the creature's lair, the realization that he was in the heart of its domain sinking in like a stone. The growl echoed again, but this time it was not just a sound, it was a vibration in the ground, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Jack's breath hitched, his heart pounding as the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It was here. It was coming. Suddenly, the fog parted, and for the first time, Jack saw it in full. It was monstrous, something neither entirely human nor fully animal. Its body was unnaturally tall, easily towering over Jack, with long, muscular limbs that looked more like those of an apex predator than a man. Its skin was a sickly pale gray, stretched tightly over bone and sinew, with patches of dark, matted hair clinging to its back and arms. But it wasn't just the grotesque appearance that froze Jack in place. It was the face, if you could even call it that. The eyes glowed a sickly yellow, wide and unblinking, filled with an ancient, feral intelligence. Its mouth was stretched into a twisted snarl, rows of jagged, animalistic teeth glistening in the dim light. But it wasn't just its appearance that was horrifying, it was the way it moved. The creature's limbs twitched and spasmed unnaturally, as if it was a hybrid of man and something much darker, much older. Its motions were quick and jerky, like a predator accustomed to hunting in the shadows, its every movement designed for terror. Jack stumbled backward, his breath shallow as he tried to retreat, but the creature was too fast. It was already closer, stepping out of the fog like a shadow made flesh, its claws scraping against the ground with an awful, grating sound. The very air around them seemed to bend, as if the swamp itself recognized the creature and was retreating, leaving them alone in the center of its twisted kingdom. "Leave me alone," Jack shouted, though his voice shook with fear, his hands raised instinctively as if to ward off the nightmare in front of him. The creature's lips curled back into a grin, but there was no humor in it. It was a predator's grin, one meant to instill terror, to paralyze its prey. And it was working. Jack could feel the fear creeping up his spine, the chilling realization that his chances of survival were slim to none. The creature didn't respond in words. Instead, it let out another guttural growl, louder, deeper, a sound that rattled the very air. It tilted its head, its glowing yellow eyes narrowing as it watched Jack with a terrifying calmness. The sound echoed through the swamp, bouncing off the trees, making Jack feel as if the whole world was closing in on him. It stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, its movements fluid and unnatural. Every step it took felt like the weight of the earth itself was shifting beneath it. Jack's legs were like lead, his body rooted to the ground despite every instinct telling him to run. The creature sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, as if savoring Jack's fear. It stepped closer still, its massive claws scraping against the earth with every movement. Jack could feel its presence surrounding him, suffocating him. It was like a nightmare come to life, something that should not exist, something born of shadow and terror. Without warning, the creature lunged. It was impossibly fast, faster than Jack could process, its claws slashing the air with a vicious snarl. Jack barely had time to react. He threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding the deadly swipe that would have torn him apart. He hit the ground hard, his body colliding with the wet earth, his heart racing in his chest as he scrambled to his feet. The creature's roar echoed through the swamp, its eyes burning with rage as it pursued him. There was no mercy in its gaze, no hesitation. It was a hunter, and Jack was its prey. The sound of its claws scraping against the ground, mixed with its growls, was deafening as it closed in on him. Jack could feel his pulse in his ears, could hear the pounding of his own heart, each beat like a drum signaling the inevitable. He ran, his legs burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The swamp was a blur around him, trees, shadows, and mist all blending together as he sprinted through the darkened landscape. He couldn't look back. He couldn't afford to. He could hear the creature behind him, the sound of it moving with an unnatural speed, growing closer with each passing second. He pushed himself harder, desperate to put distance between them. It's too fast. It's too strong. I can't outrun it. The creature was relentless, its growl reverberating in the air like a death sentence. It didn't tire. It didn't falter. Jack was running on pure adrenaline now, his mind a haze of terror and instinct. He had no plan, no idea where he was going, only the desperate need to escape. And then, as he pushed through a thick patch of brush, Jack stumbled into something that made his heart sink, a steep drop, a jagged ravine cutting through the ground. The edge was so close, and he had no time to stop. With no choice but to keep running, Jack hurled himself forward. The world blurred around him as he leapt into the unknown, the creature's roar echoing in his ears, a constant reminder of what he was running from. And as Jack fell, the swamp seemed to close its jaws around him, the fog swallowing him whole. In the creature's lair, amidst the bones and remnants of past victims, the hunt had only just begun. Jack hit the ground hard, his body crashing into the muddy ravine with a sickening thud. The wind was knocked out of him, but his mind was still sharp. Instinctively, his hand reached for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. He could feel the cold metal of the blade, the familiar weight offering a fleeting sense of reassurance. But even as he staggered to his feet, his breath ragged and panic flooding his veins, he knew the truth. This wasn't a fight he could win. The creature's growls echoed behind him, bouncing off the walls of the ravine, each step it took sending vibrations through the ground. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears as he looked around, searching for any way out, any edge that could tip the scales in his favor. But the swamp had become a twisted labyrinth, its trees and foliage closing in, and the creature's relentless pursuit was the only certainty left. He could feel the eyes on him. Those glowing yellow eyes, watching his every move from the edge of the fog, lurking in the shadows like a predator toying with its prey. It's not just hunting me, it's playing with me. Jack's grip tightened around the knife, his knuckles white with strain. The creature wasn't like anything he had ever faced. It wasn't just an animal, not just a beast, it was something else, something beyond his understanding. But he had no choice. He couldn't let it win. Survival. The word rang in his mind like a mantra as he scanned the area, looking for anything to help. His eyes darted to the trees lining the ravine. Some of them had low-hanging branches, the thick vines twisting around them, ripe for use. An idea began to form. Jack staggered to his feet and moved with surprising speed, adrenaline pushing him forward. He raced to the nearest tree, grabbing the vines with trembling hands, yanking them free from the branches. The creature's growl grew louder, closer, but Jack forced himself to focus. There was no time for fear. You've hunted before, Jack. Use your skills. He quickly tied the vines together, creating a crude snare trap, trying to remember every survival trick he had ever learned. His breath was ragged, his pulse thundering in his chest, but he had to keep going. He wasn't going to give up, not yet. He set the trap on the ground, pulling the remaining vines across the path, creating an entanglement. He only had one chance. One. The growling was deafening now, the creature so close he could almost feel the heat of its breath on his neck. He turned, heart racing, and then, there it was. The creature emerged from the fog, its hulking form taking shape as it lumbered toward him, each step a thunderous crash against the earth. Its eyes burned with a hunger so intense it seemed to pierce through Jack's very soul. It was closer now, too close. Its mouth opened in a wide snarl, revealing teeth that gleamed like razors. The air seemed to crackle with its presence, and Jack's legs shook beneath him. He could feel the ground beneath him tremble with every movement the creature made. The swamp had fallen eerily silent. This was it. Now or never. With all his strength, Jack launched himself sideways, pulling the vines and triggering the snare. The trap snapped shut with a loud crack, the thick vines wrapping around the creature's legs in an attempt to entangle it. The creature let out a deafening roar, thrashing against the trap. But Jack's heart sank as he realized how ineffective the snare had been. The creature barely slowed, its massive limbs snapping the vines apart like they were nothing more than twine. It howled in fury, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Jack barely had time to react as the creature lunged again, faster than he could comprehend. He swung his knife wildly, but the blade barely grazed the creature's skin, bouncing off its tough, leathery hide. It moved with terrifying speed, slashing with its claws, the sharp tips coming dangerously close to Jack's throat. He barely managed to duck in time, the creature's claws raking across his shoulder, tearing through fabric and skin. The pain exploded through him, but there was no time to react. The creature was already on him again. The weight of its presence was overwhelming. Every strike was like a battering ram against his body, each blow pushing him closer to the brink of collapse. Jack swung the knife again, desperately trying to find some vulnerable spot, but it was like fighting a nightmare. The creature was too powerful, too fast. Think, Jack. Think. A glint of something in the distance caught his eye, a large rock, jagged and sharp, partially buried in the mud. It wasn't much, but it was something. With a surge of adrenaline, Jack broke free from the creature's grip long enough to scramble toward the rock. The creature was close, its breath hot on his neck as it let out another terrifying roar. But Jack was already there, grabbing the rock with both hands. He swung it with all his strength, slamming it into the creature's face. The impact sent a shockwave through Jack's body, but it didn't stop the creature. It staggered back for a moment, shaking off the blow as if it had only been a slight inconvenience. The creature's eyes burned with fury as it roared again, more furious than before. It's not enough. Nothing's enough. The fight was futile. Jack was exhausted, his muscles screaming for rest, but there was no rest. There was no mercy. As the creature closed in once more, Jack's thoughts went blank. The knife felt impossibly heavy in his hand, the rock useless. The creature's claws swiped at him again, and this time, Jack couldn't avoid the strike. The last thing he felt was a sharp pain and then, nothing. The world around Jack blurred as the pain surged through his body. His vision dimmed, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. The creature's claws had torn into his side, and now the ground felt colder beneath him, the weight of the swamp pressing in from all sides. His heartbeat was slowing, the sounds of the world becoming muffled, distant. The creature's growl echoed like a death sentence in his ears, its shadow looming over him. But amidst the haze of blood and fear, a flicker of clarity sparked in Jack's mind, a final, desperate thought, a last-ditch effort to survive. Fire. The creature's lair, the dark, twisted den of bones and remnants of past victims, was surrounded by dry, rotting underbrush. The swamp was damp, yes, but fire could still spread quickly through the dense vegetation, the dry leaves, the tangled vines. The fog and the swamp's oppressive atmosphere would only fuel the fire, make it more unpredictable, more uncontrollable. It was insane. It was a gamble, a desperate shot in the dark. But it was all he had left. Jack's hand trembled as he clutched the hunting knife, still slick with his own blood, the blade now feeling like a relic in his grip. He struggled to push himself up, his vision swimming, but the thought of the creature tearing him apart spurred him into action. His muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to move, crawling toward the edge of the creature's lair, where dead wood and dry foliage lay in abundance. The creature was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching him with those unblinking yellow eyes. It growled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in Jack's chest, but it didn't approach. Not yet. It knew Jack was weakening. It could feel his fear. It was savoring his slow, inevitable demise. You can't let it win. Not like this. Not today. With a final, desperate effort, Jack dragged himself to the pile of dead wood and vines, gritting his teeth against the pain as he struggled to move. His fingers were numb, but he found what he was looking for, a half-broken branch, brittle and dry. He ripped it from the earth, desperately trying to snap off the smaller twigs. It was a crude torch, a pathetic excuse for a weapon, but it was all he had left. In the corner of his eye, he saw the creature move, its claws scraping against the stone as it prowled closer. Jack didn't look at it. He couldn't afford to. His hands fumbled with the torch, his fingers raw and shaking as he struck a match. The small flame flickered briefly in the damp air before catching on the dry wood. The torch ignited in a burst of light, a small but steady flame in his hands. Jack's heart raced as he held it up, the fire crackling and spitting as the creature drew closer, its growl deepening, a noise filled with a kind of smugness. It was close. Too close. But Jack wasn't finished. He threw the torch with all his remaining strength, hurling it toward the pile of dead foliage. The moment it touched the dry brush, the fire surged, leaping to life in an explosive burst of heat. The flames began to spread rapidly, licking at the branches and vines, the dry leaves crackling as they ignited. The creature recoiled, its glowing yellow eyes wide in momentary confusion. But it wasn't enough. The creature, though startled, wasn't afraid of fire. It wasn't like a normal animal, driven by instinct. It was something else, something ancient, something immune to such simple threats. The flames were a momentary inconvenience, a distraction, but not a solution. Jack, his strength fading, watched as the fire grew, the heat intensifying. The flames spread across the swamp, illuminating the darkened landscape in an eerie orange glow. The creature hesitated for only a moment, then let out a savage roar, leaping toward him with frightening speed. The heat of the fire stung Jack's skin, but he didn't flinch. He had done what he could. He had given everything. Now, the creature was closing in on him, its claws raised, its teeth bared in a final, vicious snarl. Jack could feel the creature's presence, the weight of its hunt pressing down on him, suffocating him. His breathing grew shallow, the world spinning around him as the creature moved in. But as it lunged, something unexpected happened. The fire that had once seemed like a feeble last resort began to grow stronger. The flames caught on the thick vines and trees, swirling in a chaotic dance of destruction. The smoke thickened, the air turned black with it. The heat was unbearable now, but it was the noise, the roar of the fire, that drowned out everything else. The creature's roar became muffled, the crackling flames drowning out the sound of its movements. Jack couldn't tell if it was the fire, the smoke, or his own exhaustion clouding his mind, but as he turned to face the creature, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. The creature was stumbling, its movements sluggish, its eyes wide with something akin to fear. The fire was closing in, and for the first time, Jack saw something in the creature's gaze that he hadn't before: uncertainty. In a final, desperate effort, the creature tried to retreat, its claws digging into the earth as it scrambled away from the flames, but it was too late. The fire had consumed everything in its path, and now the swamp was a raging inferno. The creature's howl became a high-pitched screech, a noise filled with terror, as it was consumed by the flames. Jack watched, his body barely able to stand, as the creature's form dissolved into the fire, the shadows of its twisted body flickering and distorting in the heat. The flames swallowed it whole, leaving nothing behind but the crackling of the burning swamp. Jack could barely hold himself upright, the world spinning around him. His vision was fading, his limbs too weak to support him. As the fire raged behind him, he stumbled forward, every step a battle against the overwhelming fatigue that threatened to pull him under. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to fall to the ground, the weight of exhaustion taking him as the sounds of the burning swamp surrounded him. The fire's roar faded into a distant crackle, leaving the world in an eerie, suffocating silence. The swamp, once a place of haunting whispers and unsettling sounds, was now still. The air was thick with smoke, a stinging haze that burned Jack's lungs, but amidst the pain, there was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The oppressive fog had lifted, replaced by a strange calm. Jack staggered through the charred remains of the swamp, his legs barely holding him up. His body ached with the kind of deep exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. It was as if every step drained the last reserves of his strength. His shirt was torn, soaked with blood and sweat, and his skin burned from the smoke and the fire's heat. His breathing was shallow, his chest tight with every inhalation, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. I did it. I killed it. The thought echoed in his mind, a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. Had the creature really been destroyed, consumed by the flames? Was it truly over? Jack glanced back, half expecting to see the creature's twisted form rising from the ashes, but there was nothing. Only the remnants of the fire, smoldering embers, a blackened landscape where trees had once stood, their charred skeletons reaching toward the sky like the hands of the dead. It should have been over. It should have felt like victory. But instead, a chill crept through him, one that had nothing to do with the cold air. The silence was unsettling, unnatural, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. The distant call of birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, everything had been drowned by the fire's rage. Even the insects, those constant companions of the swamp, had vanished. The world felt too still, too empty. Jack swallowed hard, trying to push the feeling aside. His hand still gripped the hunting knife, the weapon stained with the blood of his battle. He could feel it, the weight of the knife in his hand, a reminder of everything he had fought through. He had to get out. He had to leave this place, this nightmare behind. The swamp had already taken too much from him, his strength, his sanity, his peace of mind. And though he felt like he had conquered it, he knew better than to trust the silence. He had been deceived before. This place was not one that could be easily defeated. No more doubts. No more running. He pushed forward, forcing his legs to move, each step feeling like an eternity. The path ahead was difficult to follow, the familiar landmarks now burned beyond recognition. The ground was uneven, cracked and blackened by the fire's wrath, but Jack didn't care. He moved with single-minded determination, his only goal the distant edge of the swamp where the trees began to thin out, where he could find a road, a town, anything to bring him back to civilization. The journey felt endless, each step heavier than the last. His mind wandered, the adrenaline of the fight slowly draining from his system, leaving only the aching reality of what he had been through. His body was broken, battered by the creature's attacks and the harsh environment of the swamp. But it was his mind, his sanity, that was slowly starting to unravel. What if it's not really gone? The thought pierced through his exhaustion like a knife. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it. He had to believe it. He had to believe that the creature was dead, that the fire had consumed it, turned it to ash. But even as he told himself this, a deeper fear began to seep in. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence of the swamp. It was the feeling in his chest, the sense that something wasn't finished, that there was still something out there. Something watching. Jack stopped in his tracks, his heart racing again. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he listened. His breath hitched as the silence stretched on, each second heavier than the last. There was nothing. The silence had returned. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the charred trees, the fog now thickening once more, creeping in like a living thing. He couldn't shake the feeling. It was too quiet. The swamp was too still. Then, a sound. Faint at first, just the faintest rustle, like a twig snapping underfoot. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He tensed, every muscle going rigid, every instinct screaming at him to run. But where could he go? He was already lost, trapped in the depths of the swamp, surrounded by nothing but death and ruin. And then, just like that, he heard it. A growl. Soft, low, almost imperceptible. But unmistakable. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the sound reverberated in the still air. It wasn't the same as before. This time, it was almost distant. Muted. As if the creature was hiding in the depths, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he spun around, scanning the darkening landscape. But there was nothing. No movement. No sign of the beast. Just the suffocating silence, broken only by the low, rumbling growl that seemed to be coming from all around him. The creature was still here. The growl echoed through the fog, reverberating in Jack's chest like the sound of thunder rolling over the horizon. His heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as panic surged through him. The creature was still alive. He had seen it burn, heard its screeches as the flames tore through the swamp, but now, standing in the thickening mist, he realized the horrifying truth. It hadn't died. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the ground beneath him, a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. His body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to run, to escape, but his legs felt like stone, paralyzed by the fear clawing at his insides. The creature's presence was undeniable now. He could feel it, like a shadow stalking him, its malicious intent lingering in the air. Jack didn't need to see it to know it was near. The sound of something moving, something too fast, too fluid to be human, came from just beyond the veil of fog. He couldn't see through the thick, damp air, but he could feel the weight of its gaze, burning into the back of his neck. The creature was watching him. Waiting. His mind raced. He had to make it out. There had to be a way. He couldn't survive this again. The fight, no, the battle, had already broken him. The swamp had already claimed too much of him. The fire had failed. It hadn't destroyed the creature. It had only angered it. It's more powerful now. More dangerous. Jack's thoughts spun in a chaotic whirl as he stumbled backward, his legs shaking, his breath shallow. He gripped the knife in his hand like a lifeline, the weapon trembling in his grasp. The swamp felt alive again, the air thick with the scent of smoke and decay, the ground beneath his boots slick with mud. The sound of the creature's growl grew louder, closer, like a drumbeat in the silence. Each step it took was deliberate, calculated. It was closing in on him. And Jack, despite all his efforts, was still in its domain. Suddenly, a shape darted out of the fog, too fast for his eyes to track. Jack barely had time to react as a dark form lunged at him with incredible speed, slamming into his chest with the force of a freight train. The impact knocked the breath out of him, sending him crashing to the ground, the weight of the creature's body pinning him down. His hand flew instinctively to the knife, but the creature's claws scraped against his skin, pulling at his clothes, digging into his flesh, sending sharp bursts of pain through his body. The creature's low growl rumbled in his ears as it snarled, its face twisted into a grotesque, half-human, half-animal mask. Its glowing yellow eyes locked with his, and for a moment, Jack could see the malice, the hunger, in them. The fire had scarred it, but it hadn't broken it. It was only more enraged now. Its form was leaner, faster, the muscles in its limbs rippling as it moved with terrifying agility. I'm going to die here. I'm going to die in this hell. The thought was a cold knot in his stomach, a truth he hadn't wanted to admit, but now had no choice but to face. He had failed. The swamp had claimed him. The creature was no longer just a predator, it was a force of nature, relentless and unstoppable. In a final act of desperation, Jack drove the knife forward, aiming for the creature's throat. It dodged effortlessly, twisting its body with unnatural speed, the blade grazing its flesh but doing little to stop its advance. The creature bared its teeth, a terrible, wicked grin forming on its twisted face. It was playing with him now. Then, with horrifying clarity, Jack realized something. The creature wasn't just hunting him. It wasn't just trying to kill him. It was toying with him, savoring his fear, watching him struggle as it took its time. This isn't just a fight for survival. It's revenge. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body was frozen, locked in place by the weight of terror, by the overwhelming sense that escape was impossible. The swamp was its home. The creature owned this place, and Jack was just another plaything in its twisted game. Suddenly, the creature paused, its claws hovering inches from Jack's throat. Its eyes, filled with burning hatred, glowed even brighter in the dim light. For a moment, everything stopped. The growls, the fog, the sounds of the swamp, all faded into an eerie quiet. It was almost as if the world was holding its breath. And then, in one fluid motion, the creature withdrew, its claws sliding away from Jack's skin, leaving him gasping for air. He stared up at it, wide-eyed, confused. Why had it stopped? The creature didn't answer. Instead, it backed away, its glowing eyes never leaving Jack's face. Its lips curled into a malicious grin, showing off sharp, jagged teeth. Then, without another sound, it melted into the fog, disappearing as quickly as it had come. Jack lay there, breathless, covered in sweat and dirt, his body trembling from the adrenaline, the fear, the pain. He didn't understand what had just happened. Why had it spared him? Why hadn't it finished him off? The terror that had gripped his chest moments before now felt like a distant memory, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. This wasn't over. The creature was still out there, watching, waiting. It had only let him live to continue its twisted game. And Jack knew, deep in his bones, that this time there would be no escape. Jack's chest heaved with every labored breath. His body trembled, soaked in sweat and blood, every inch of him screaming in agony. The swamp seemed to close in around him, its thick, suffocating fog a constant reminder of how trapped he was. The creature's growls echoed in the distance, still present, still waiting, its eyes forever etched into his memory. It had spared him earlier, but Jack understood now. It hadn't been mercy. It had been amusement. The creature wasn't done with him. No, it was biding its time, savoring the terror, relishing in the fact that it had him where it wanted. The realization hit him like a fist to the gut. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore, it was about dominion. The creature was the master of this swamp, and he was just another victim in its game. He had to stop it. He had to make sure it didn't leave this place, didn't spread its nightmare beyond the edges of the swamp. If it did, the terror it had brought upon him would extend to the rest of the world. He couldn't let that happen. Not after everything he had endured. The fire hadn't worked. The traps hadn't worked. It had all been futile. But there was one thing left. Jack's eyes darted through the thick fog, his mind racing. His pulse thudded in his temples as the weight of his decision crushed down on him. His legs were weak and his body was broken, but in that moment he felt a cold clarity. This was the only way to stop the creature. To prevent it from leaving the swamp. He was already lost. His body was a map of wounds, his mind barely holding on to sanity. The creature had already claimed his soul, in a way. But if he could give his life, his very being, as a distraction, maybe, just maybe, he could buy enough time for the swamp to reclaim its power. Jack swallowed hard, forcing down the bile that rose in his throat. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was a sacrifice. His body, his life, would be the bait, the offering that kept the creature tethered to this cursed land. The decision came swiftly, the finality of it almost comforting. There was no turning back. No escape. If he stayed alive, the creature would hunt him down, relentless as ever. But if he died, maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to ensure that it never left. I'll be the trap. Jack stumbled toward the heart of the swamp, the fog wrapping around him like a shroud. His knife was still gripped in his hand, but it felt like an empty gesture now. The creature was beyond being slain by mere steel. No. It was a force of nature, and it had no weaknesses. Except one. The swamp was its home. It was bound to it. And so, Jack would offer himself as a sacrifice to bind the creature just as the swamp had bound him. He found what he was looking for. A deep, murky pool of water surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to rise like monstrous arms, their gnarled roots creeping into the dark depths. This was the heart of the swamp, where the fog was thickest, where the ground felt soft and treacherous, and the air hung heavy with a sense of ancient, terrible power. The creature had no need to leave. It was in its element here, and here Jack would make his stand. He had no illusions that this would be easy. The creature would come for him, would savor his fear, his pain. But Jack was done running. Done hiding. He would meet the beast here, in the very place it thrived, and give everything to ensure it never escaped. As he crouched by the edge of the pool, he could feel the weight of his decision sinking into him like the muck beneath his feet. He closed his eyes, letting the swamp's cold breath wash over him, and he whispered a prayer, though he wasn't sure to whom. It was a prayer for redemption. For peace. For the end of this nightmare. The ground trembled beneath him. A low growl rumbled from the depths of the fog, the unmistakable sound of the creature approaching. It was drawn to him like a magnet, its eyes burning through the mist, its sharp claws scraping against the damp earth. Jack didn't flinch. He couldn't. He had come this far, and now there was no turning back. The creature emerged from the fog like a nightmare come to life, its body silhouetted against the pale light of the moon. Its fur was scorched in places, but it moved with the same terrifying grace, its eyes glowing with hunger, with fury. It saw Jack, and in that moment, Jack knew it recognized what he was doing. It snarled, its mouth stretching wide in a twisted grin, revealing rows of sharp teeth that dripped with saliva. It didn't need to speak. Its presence said everything. You're mine. Jack didn't wait for it to make the first move. He let out a primal scream, throwing himself into the murky water, the cold of it sinking into his bones. The creature lunged after him, its form a blur of darkness and violence, but Jack's movements were calculated, deliberate. He drew the creature deeper into the heart of the swamp, deeper into the trap he had set. The water churned around them as the beast followed, its growl filling the air, shaking the very ground beneath Jack's feet. The swamp was its home. And now, it would be its prison. With one last, desperate effort, Jack let the water swallow him, sinking beneath the surface, pulling the creature down with him. His hand reached into the muck, pulling up thick ropes of moss and vines that he had carefully placed earlier. With one final, trembling motion, he wrapped them around the creature's limbs, binding it, trapping it in the swamp's grip. The creature roared in fury, its claws scraping at the vines, but it was too late. It was trapped. Jack's vision blurred as the water closed in over him, the weight of his sacrifice pulling him under. The last thing he saw was the creature's furious, twisting face, its eyes wide with rage and desperation. And then, darkness. The world felt like it was slipping away from Jack. His body was heavy, submerged in the cold, murky water. The chill seeped into his very bones, wrapping around his heart, squeezing the last remnants of life from his veins. His muscles ached, and his chest burned as he fought to hold on to consciousness, but the darkness was spreading, creeping into the edges of his vision. The swamp was claiming him. The creature's struggles had become muffled as it sank into the depths, its enraged roars drowned by the thick, suffocating water. Jack knew it wasn't over yet, but the swamp had already begun to take what it was owed. His lungs burned, his limbs weak and uncooperative, his thoughts slipping like fragments of a dream. The world around him swirled into a dizzying whirl of black water, the fog, the shadows of trees. Everything was fading. It's done, he thought, though his mind couldn't fully grasp the enormity of his action. The creature was bound. It would never leave. The swamp had claimed its prize, and in turn, had taken him. His fingers, slick with cold water and mud, clawed helplessly at the surface, but the swamp was insistent. It pulled at him, urging him down deeper, dragging him into its thick, suffocating embrace. The vines, the roots, they were alive, twisting around him like the fingers of some ancient, forgotten god, pulling him into the muck. There was no escape. His body was heavy with the weight of the swamp, with the weight of his sacrifice. He couldn't see anymore. His eyes burned, the water stinging them, blurring the world into nothing but shapes, shadows, and the relentless press of water against his skin. His breath came in shallow gasps, but it was too little. Too late. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rotting wood and earth, and he knew, in the deepest part of his soul, that this was the end. I've failed, but I've saved them. The thought came to him like a fleeting whisper, almost drowned out by the rush of water in his ears. The swamp had claimed him, and it would keep its hold. It was ancient, unyielding, and as much a part of this land as the very trees and mud. His body, already broken and bloodied, sank lower, swallowed by the depths. His muscles gave out, his hands slipping from their feeble grasp on the muck, his mind losing its battle to the quiet darkness of unconsciousness. He no longer felt the cold or the weight. No more pain, no more fear. The creature, the hunt, the swamp, it was all becoming a distant memory, something that didn't belong to him anymore. It was as though the swamp itself had absorbed him, as though his body was a part of the earth now, becoming one with the land he had tried so desperately to escape. The final surrender came quietly, as the swamp took Jack's body into its grasp, pulling him deeper, farther into its dark, secret heart. His last breath bubbled to the surface, mixing with the thick, oppressive air, before it was swallowed by the earth below. The swamp had claimed him. And as Jack's body was swallowed by the endless muck, a strange calm settled over the land. The fog thickened, the water stilled. In the depths, where Jack's body would never be found, a new chapter in the swamp's twisted history had begun. The creature was gone. Jack was gone. But the swamp remained. It always remained. The swamp had swallowed Jack whole, pulling his body into its dark heart, and with it, the last flicker of resistance. The fog, thick and oppressive, clung to the ground like a veil, muting everything in its path. For a long time, there was only silence, an eerie stillness that seemed to stretch forever, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The trees stood like sentinels, their twisted branches reaching for the dark sky, their roots sinking deep into the wet earth, as if they too were waiting for something. And then, the silence shattered. From the depths of the swamp, there came a sound, low and guttural, reverberating through the water and into the air. A growl, deep and ferocious, echoed through the trees, rolling across the marshes like thunder. It was the sound of triumph, of an ancient beast claiming its victory. The creature had emerged from the muck, its dark form slinking through the fog, its movements swift and unnatural. It stood taller now, more powerful. The fire had scarred it, but those marks only made it more monstrous. The creature's fur, once sleek and dark, was now matted and patchy, but its glowing eyes burned brighter than ever. It moved like a shadow, the fog bending around it, parting like the sea for a king. It was free, no longer bound by the swamp's ancient rules, no longer shackled by anything or anyone. It was victorious. Its gaze, sharp and focused, swept over the stillness of the swamp as if savoring its newfound dominion. There was no more fear in the air, only the thick weight of its presence. The swamp was its kingdom now, its territory, and nothing would challenge its rule again. Not the hunter, not the swamp's ancient guardians, and certainly not the human who had dared to defy it. Jack had been nothing more than a fleeting distraction, a brief moment of struggle before the inevitable. The creature's breath came in ragged, hungry bursts. Its claws scraped against the wet ground, leaving deep furrows in the mud, marking the territory it now controlled. There was no need to hunt anymore. There was no need to fear. The swamp was alive with the creature's power. Every tree, every shadow, every gust of wind whispered its name. It was no longer just a predator of the swamp. It was the swamp. It paused for a moment, its glowing eyes narrowing as it sniffed the air. Jack's scent was still faintly lingering, a bitter reminder of the man who had tried to challenge it. But that scent would soon be gone, lost to the swamp forever. The creature turned its gaze toward the water, where Jack's body had been taken, and a low rumble of satisfaction rolled from its throat. The beast was the true ruler now, and nothing would stop its reign. The swamp, once again, grew still. The fog thickened, the shadows deepened. And the creature, its victory complete, began to move through the marsh, its powerful limbs slicing through the fog like a specter, as it returned to its lair, where it would wait for the next trespasser, the next soul foolish enough to wander too deep into its domain. The cycle would continue. The hunter had become the hunted, and the creature, undefeated, would forever rule the swamp. The air in the small Alabama town was thick with gossip, as the news of Jack's disappearance spread like wildfire. The people who had once known him, his fellow hunters, and the few brave souls who ventured into the swamp, spoke in hushed tones of his ill-fated journey. The story was always the same. Jack had gone into the swamp, determined to hunt down the mysterious creature that had terrorized the region for decades, but he never came back. And now, weeks later, the swamp was even more dangerous, its silence more oppressive, its shadows deeper. At the local tavern, the elderly men gathered, their faces drawn with age and worry, their voices low but insistent. They spoke of the creature, the beast that no one could understand, no one could truly defeat. Some claimed it was an ancient spirit, a guardian of the swamp. Others whispered that it was something far worse, something born of twisted science or dark magic, a mutation that had been lurking in the shadows for generations. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that it was real. The creature was real, and it had claimed Jack. Seen him myself, old Earl muttered one evening, his eyes glazed with the fog of memory. That thing, it's faster than any man, bigger than any beast. Ain't no gun or trap can catch it. And I don't reckon Jack ever stood a chance. Around the table, the others nodded grimly, each of them haunted by the memory of a time when the swamp had seemed like just another piece of the land. Now, it was a place of fear. The stories had always been whispered, of strange sounds at night, of shadows moving where there should be none, but now they carried weight. The truth of the creature's existence had settled into the bones of every local, and it would never leave. In the weeks that followed, there were fewer hunters, fewer travelers daring to step foot in the swamps. Those who had once ventured there for sport or for resources now avoided the area entirely. The once quiet landscape was now a place of dread. The woods felt heavier, the very air laden with tension. The town, normally a place where people greeted each other with friendly waves, now exchanged nervous glances, as if the very land itself had become infected with fear. Children no longer played near the edges of the swamp, and the fishermen kept their boats close to shore, their eyes scanning the dark waters for signs of the creature. In the dead of night, some of the bravest souls would hear strange noises, guttural growls carried on the wind, or the sound of something moving through the trees, too fast to be human. Some swore they saw eyes glowing in the distance, flickers of movement at the edge of the fog, but when they ventured closer, there was nothing there but the whispering of the leaves. A few old-timers had warned Jack before he ever set foot in the swamp, telling him stories of the beast, of the darkness that lay beneath the waters. But Jack had been a stubborn man, a man who refused to listen, who believed that a hunter could always outsmart his prey. Now, his name was becoming legend, another cautionary tale in a town full of them. His disappearance was woven into the fabric of the creature's myth, a story to be told around campfires and over dinner tables for generations to come. In the end, Jack had become a part of the swamp, his legacy etched into the very land that had taken him. The creature's reign continued, its presence woven into the stories that would be passed down, the fear it instilled spreading like a plague, never to be forgotten. As the years went by, the people of the town learned to live with the fear. They accepted it, like the fog that always hung over the swamp, like the damp air that clung to their skin. It was just a part of life now, the creature in the swamp, the beast that Jack had never truly defeated. And deep within the heart of the swamp, the creature waited, its eyes always watching, its hunger never sated. Months passed, and life in the town slowly settled back into a strange, uneasy normalcy. The locals had learned to live with the silence that stretched over the swamp, a silence that carried the weight of Jack's disappearance and the growing legend of the creature. But legends, no matter how terrifying, often sparked something in the hearts of the bold, the curious, and the foolish. It wasn't long before whispers began to circulate about newcomers, outsiders who had heard the stories and felt the pull of the swamp's dark mystery. They were drawn not just by the idea of the creature itself, but by the challenge it posed. To those who had never seen the swamp, to those who had no memory of Jack, the stories were just that, stories. And for some, that was enough to set their blood racing. One evening, as the wind picked up and the sun sank behind the trees, a pair of men entered the town. They were young, brash, and full of bravado. Hunter types, from the looks of them, rifles slung over their shoulders, backpacks filled with gear, their eyes gleaming with the excitement of the hunt. They were veterans of other hunts, other terrains, but this was something new. The swamp was an unknown, a challenge they couldn't resist. "You all know anything about the creature in the swamp?" one of them asked, a grin playing at the corner of his lips. The older men in the tavern exchanged wary glances, their faces darkening at the mention of it. Old Earl, who had witnessed more than his share of strange occurrences, took a long swig from his glass before speaking. "The creature's real, all right," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "And it's no friend to men like you. Best turn back now. The swamp doesn't forget." But the two young hunters only laughed. "We've heard the stories. Thought we'd come check it out for ourselves," said the other, a taller man with sharp eyes and an eager smile. "How hard can it be? We've dealt with worse things than ghosts and rumors." The older men didn't respond, their silence speaking volumes. They didn't want to frighten the young fools, but it was clear they weren't going to change their minds. The two hunters were already packed and ready to go, filled with the overconfidence of youth and the belief that they were invincible. The next morning, they left the town before the first light, setting off toward the swamp's edge. The townspeople watched them go, some muttering under their breath, others shaking their heads, but no one stopped them. Everyone knew what would happen next. It always happened like this. By midday, the hunters had entered the swamp, the dense fog curling around them like a living thing. The air was thick and sticky, pressing down on them as they made their way deeper into the trees. The silence of the swamp was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the distant croak of a frog. It was a silence that made the heart race, that kept the hunters alert, but it wasn't enough to dissuade them. Not yet. "Look at this place," one of the hunters said, his voice full of awe. "It's just like in the stories, isn't it? Creepy as hell." The other hunter chuckled, his confidence never wavering. "We'll find it. The creature's probably just some big, overgrown thing. Nothing we can't handle." But as the hours wore on, their mood began to shift. The swamp, it seemed, wasn't as forgiving as they had hoped. They'd expected a quick hunt, find the beast, track it down, make their names, but the deeper they ventured, the more disorienting the terrain became. The paths were confusing, the trees growing denser, the fog thicker. Every turn they took seemed to lead them in circles, the air growing heavier, as if the swamp itself was pushing back against them. Suddenly, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving fast through the underbrush. A rustle, followed by the rapid beat of something large on the move. "It's just an animal," one of the hunters said, his hand gripping the rifle a little tighter. But there was no mistaking the feeling that followed. A shiver ran down their spines as they realized they were being watched. The oppressive silence returned, but now it was broken by the distant sound of something heavy moving through the swamp, closer, faster, too fast to be human. The first signs of the creature's presence came like a whisper on the wind, small things at first. A shadow darting through the trees, a quick rustle in the bushes, a movement too swift to identify. Then came the tracks, large, clawed impressions in the mud, leading off in a direction they dared not follow. But the hunters, determined to prove themselves, pressed on, ignoring the growing unease gnawing at their instincts. That night, as they set up camp, the creature's presence became undeniable. The air was thick with tension, the sounds of the swamp louder now, more threatening. There were growls in the distance, too close for comfort, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, animal-like, but deeper, more menacing. Something moved in the shadows, too quick to catch a glimpse of. And then, the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping behind them. The hunters turned, their hearts pounding in their chests, but by then it was too late. The creature had already found them. The swamp, with its twisted, gnarled trees and fog-choked air, seemed to have a way of holding onto its secrets. It waited, patiently, as time passed and the stories of the beast faded into whispered legends, just another chapter in the town's dark history. But the creature, the terror of the swamp, never truly rested. It simply waited for the next foolish souls to wander into its domain. The two hunters, full of bravado and ambition, had met their fate as so many before them had. The creature had taken them quickly, silently, like a predator moving through the shadows. Their bodies were never found, lost to the swamp, their lives swallowed whole by its relentless hunger. News of their disappearance traveled through the town, though no one spoke of it too openly. The townspeople had learned long ago that some things were better left undiscussed. The younger generations, those who hadn't heard the stories firsthand, listened to the older ones with an uneasy respect. And as the stories of Jack and the two hunters grew into another layer of the creature's myth, the swamp began to reclaim its reputation once more. The beast had returned, hunting again, and the fear was palpable. Soon, others began to hear the same rumors, the same quiet whispers about the creature stalking the swamp. Brave souls, maybe foolish, maybe not, began to trickle into town, each one driven by their own motives. Some came seeking adventure, some for fame, some for the challenge. They, like the hunters before them, heard the stories, and yet they believed they could conquer the impossible. And so the swamp welcomed them. One night, a group of friends, bored and looking for thrills, ventured into the swamp. They'd heard the legends, sure, but they dismissed them as superstition. After all, who could believe in something so monstrous, so unexplainable? They figured the stories were simply exaggerations, tales spun to scare children or keep people from straying too far from the safety of the town. They set out with laughter in the air and flashlights in hand, excited by the prospect of exploring a haunted place. The swamp, in the dark, looked even more eerie than they had imagined, trees twisted in odd shapes, the mist clinging to the ground like something alive, and the quiet only broken by the occasional croak of a distant frog. But as they ventured deeper, the mood began to shift. The eerie silence, once nothing more than an oddity, began to feel like something else, a warning. They brushed it off, laughing nervously as they walked, but each step they took seemed to echo louder in the growing darkness. And then they saw it, tracks, large and deep, etched into the soft ground. At first, they thought it might be the work of a bear or some other large creature. But the tracks didn't make sense. There was something about the shape, the size, that didn't add up. They were far too large, and yet they seemed wrong. One of the group, a man named Ben, bent down to get a closer look. "What do you think this is?" he asked, but no one answered. A strange tension had begun to settle over them. The sound of branches snapping nearby broke the silence. A low growl followed, distant at first but growing louder, nearer. The group froze. Their flashlights flickered, their breath quickening, as if the swamp itself had taken a deep, expectant breath. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash, a massive figure moving through the underbrush. The air seemed to change. The swamp had gone from quiet to charged with a palpable energy. The hairs on their necks stood on end as they turned to look toward the source of the noise. But there was nothing there, just the dense fog, thick and impenetrable, closing in around them. Then came the sound, the unmistakable sound of something fast, too fast for any normal animal, moving just beyond the trees. The group began to backtrack, heartbeats pounding in their chests. But it was already too late. From the depths of the mist, something emerged, a shape, a blur of darkness that was moving with unnatural speed. The creature's eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger, and its growl was deafening now, a low rumble that shook the very ground beneath them. Panic set in. Ben shouted, but his voice was drowned by the sound of the creature's approach. One of the others turned to run, but before he could take more than a few steps, he was snatched up by the beast, its claws raking through the air and dragging him back into the fog. The remaining friends screamed, but their cries were swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The creature was everywhere at once, its presence impossible to track, its speed unmatched. One by one, the group fell victim to its relentless hunt. They had ventured too far into the swamp, too deep into its grasp, and the beast was not merciful. Hours later, when the dawn light filtered weakly through the trees, the swamp was still and silent again. The creature had taken what it wanted, and once more, the swamp returned to its eerie calm. The bones of the new victims would be swallowed by the mud, hidden from view, leaving only the whispers of the lost. Back in town, the first rumors began to spread. The friends who had gone into the swamp were never seen again. Their families came searching, but they found nothing. No bodies. No signs. Only the empty, mocking silence of the swamp. And once again, the creature's legend grew. The people who lived near the swamp began to remember, again, the warning in Old Earl's voice, the swamp don't forget. It'll always take more. The beast, it seemed, would never stop hunting. History, as it often does, repeated itself. And the terror of the swamp would continue, its reach never loosening, its hunger never sated. The fog had settled thick over the town once again, a quiet blanket that muffled the voices of the townsfolk. The stories of the creature continued to circulate, but to the younger generations, it was becoming more of a fable than a warning. They spoke of it in hushed tones, sure, but there was little fear in their voices, just the thrill of a tale to tell, the mystery of something that had happened long before they were born. The hermit, however, knew the truth. He had seen it, lived through it. But as the years wore on, the town's memory faded, and the younger folk paid less and less attention to the warnings he shared. No one had paid much mind to him in the first place, but now, as more people wandered into the swamp, seeking adventure or challenge, the hermit found himself speaking more often of what he knew. But it seemed, as always, that no one would listen. The hermit sat by the fire outside his small, crumbling cabin, his weathered hands clutching a pipe as he stared out into the endless, shifting expanse of the swamp. The fog clung to the trees like a living thing, curling around them in eerie tendrils. The hermit had lived alone in these parts for decades, the memories of his youth etched deeply into his mind. It was Jack he remembered most, Jack, who had listened to the warning, at least for a time. The boy hadn't been foolish, he had known the risks. But even Jack's caution couldn't save him in the end. The swamp was unforgiving. The creature was relentless. As the hermit stared into the fire, his mind drifted back to the day Jack had come to him, wide-eyed and eager to learn. Jack had come seeking knowledge of the swamp, and the hermit had shared his warnings, his tales of the creature that stalked the dense underbrush, hidden from sight but always watching, always waiting. "You don't understand," the hermit had told him, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to carry the weight of years of lost souls. "It's not just an animal. It's something else. Something that doesn't belong. And once it's tasted blood, it won't stop. It'll hunt you until you're nothing but bones in the muck." Jack had listened intently, but when the hermit had told him to leave the swamp, to turn back before it was too late, Jack had smiled and shrugged. "I've been in tougher places, old man. I'll be fine." The hermit had shaken his head. He had seen it too many times before. Young men with fire in their eyes, ready to prove themselves in the face of something they couldn't understand. They always thought they were different. They never thought it would be them. The hermit's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. His sharp eyes flicked up, and he saw two strangers emerging from the mist, their faces eager and confident. They were young, too young, it seemed, and their expressions were full of that same brash overconfidence the hermit had seen in so many before. They were hunters, by the looks of them, rifles, backpacks, and the unmistakable air of men who thought they knew what they were doing. They heard the stories, no doubt, but they were drawn by the idea of proving the old man wrong, as most others had been. "Excuse me," one of them called out, their voice cheerful but carrying a note of arrogance. "We heard there's a creature in these swamps. Some kind of beast? We're here to hunt it." The hermit let out a long sigh, his old eyes narrowing. He had seen this too many times. The same words, the same foolish confidence. They didn't understand. They didn't know what they were dealing with. "The swamp's not a place for games," the hermit said, his voice rough with age and experience. It'll swallow you whole, and when it does, you won't even know it. That creature isn't just an animal, it's something worse. It hunts, but it does more than that. It waits. And it won't stop until you're nothing but dust. The two men laughed, exchanging a look that the hermit knew all too well. It was the look of men who thought they were untouchable, who didn't believe in the terror they were about to face. "We've hunted bigger things than stories," the other hunter said, his grin wide. "We'll be fine. Don't worry about us, old man." The hermit shook his head, a shadow of regret crossing his face. "The swamp don't care who you are," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "And neither does the creature." But the hunters weren't listening. They had already started walking away, their voices rising in laughter as they moved deeper into the mist. The hermit stood, his hands trembling slightly as he clenched his pipe tighter. He knew what would happen next, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had warned them, just as he had warned Jack. But the creature's hunger didn't care about warnings. It didn't care about the past. It only cared about one thing, the hunt. The hermit watched the hunters disappear into the fog, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what awaited them. They wouldn't be the first to fall. And they wouldn't be the last. With a final, long breath, he turned away, retreating into his cabin. The creature was out there, hunting again. And once more, the swamp was ready to claim its next victims. The swamp had claimed its secrets for centuries, its dark waters concealing the truth beneath layers of mud and mist. And still, despite the warnings, despite the tales of those who had disappeared into its depths, the creature's presence remained a mystery to all but the few who had lived to tell the tale, and they were too few to make a difference. The fog had thickened once more as the hermit disappeared into his cabin, his eyes weary and resigned. The two hunters, full of their own bravado, would learn the harsh truth of the swamp soon enough. But even that truth would be lost to time, swallowed by the mist that rolled over the land like a living thing, a veil that hid the darkness from all but those unlucky enough to cross its path. As the hermit's cabin grew smaller in the distance, the swamp seemed to stretch endlessly, its quiet broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or the distant call of a bird. The silence, once calming, had become unsettling. The air was thick with tension, and in that stillness, the creature waited. The cycle had endured for as long as anyone could remember, and it would continue long after the hermit was gone, long after the two hunters were reduced to nothing but stories and shadows. The swamp was a place where the past never truly disappeared. The bones of the lost remained hidden in its depths, part of its twisted landscape, part of its eternal hunger. For some, the swamp was a place of beauty, its moss-covered trees and winding rivers, a tranquil retreat for those who could escape the noise of the world. But for those who truly knew it, it was something darker, something more sinister. It was a place that took what it wanted and left only echoes of fear and loss in its wake. And the creature, the terrible thing that stalked its shores, had become part of its legend. A force that neither time nor death could erase. It was never truly gone, never truly defeated. It waited, ever patient, as the swamp's dark secrets beckoned the next foolish soul to wander in. As the years passed, new hunters, adventurers, and thrill-seekers would arrive, each drawn by the allure of the swamp's mystery, unaware of the true danger lurking beneath the surface. Some would disappear without a trace. Others might leave, but they would never be the same. And all of them would become just another part of the creature's story, another chapter in the endless cycle of the hunt. The creature, a blend of nightmare and myth, was always watching, always listening. It had no need for reason, no need for explanation. It existed to hunt, to survive, and to consume. And until the end of time, it would continue its endless pursuit, never stopping, never resting. The swamp remained, as it always had been, silent, waiting, its dark heart beating in the shadows. And the creature waited with it, the next chapter of its terrifying legend yet to be written. For as long as the fog rolled in, as long as the trees whispered in the wind, the cycle would endure. The mystery of the swamp, the horror it contained, would never be solved. And the creature would always be there, waiting for its next prey. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.